Hello, my name's Long. Welcome to the second video on my channel. Today I have a guest named Ray, who's a really experienced player in the community. And today we're just going to nerd out a bit and talk a lot about boards. Really deep dive into the theory of boards, what makes a board good, what makes a board bad, etc. But first, let's get our introductions out of the way. Ray, do you want to talk about yourself just a little bit so people know who you are?
Yeah. So I'm Ray. I've been playing Spirit Island since 2018. Many people probably know me from the Discord or from some guides that I've put out on BGG for some spirits. Um, but yeah, joining along today.
Yeah, thanks. And obviously, I'm the main workhorse behind the Finder Guide on this channel, and hopefully there'll be some more videos to come there. But back on topic here, the topic of discussion for today is boards. And boards, I think, is one of those things in Spirit Island that I think it can get really deep and really interesting, but for the most part, I think most players just look at a board and they just pick the one that gives them like the best adjacencies with their setup, with a given spirit. But I think there's a lot of theory here. There's a lot of interesting stuff to nerd out about, and that's kind of the goal of this video. Um, as you can see, we've laid out a bunch of minor powers, events, and major powers. We've showed the setup for every single board here. And so let me give you sort of a rough rundown of the main topics we plan to cover. So the first topic that we'll probably cover is terrain distribution and thinking really deep about terrains. We're going to talk about why we don't think that the terrains are kind of made equal by the decks, and talk about like which terrains have advantages, disadvantages, which ones need to be prioritized, etc., etc. We're also going to talk about token placement and token value. So, for instance, on all of these boards, while the disease may be locked in land 2, the beast is in very different lands across all these boards, and that has a pretty big impact on how that board plays out. And also, particularly relates to like action eco saving, edge cases, playing into probabilistic play, stuff like that. Um, we're also going to talk about adjacencies and the actual land interconnections. So, for instance, we're definitely going to talk about on board D how land 1 is connected to everything and what that means in a deeper sense. And why certain boards feel different when you're trying to pocket or go for different types of strategies like control, tempo, etc., than others. We're going to talk about starting tokens like where's the blight, how are the Dahan distributed, etc., etc. We're also going to talk about adversary setups. Certain boards just don't kind of get the short end of the stick, we think, with regards to certain adversary setups, and might be things that you want to think about or potentially avoid going into certain adversary games for you in the future. And obviously, we're going to go through the minor and major powers here that we feel like benefit from playing with sort of a board theory oriented mindset. We'll highlight some events and might even fit in some fun facts and spirit facts along the way. So I think that was a pretty exhaustive table of contents. We'll see how well we adhere to it, but um, do you have any thoughts, Ray, before we dive into our first topic here?
No, it sounds good.
All right, so I think the first topic on the menu today is terrains. I think this is a really interesting topic because I like certainly and like in board theory, we feel like that certain terrains aren't equal compared to others, and that certain terrains need to be prioritized before the game even starts. And do you want to start giving like an example, say on board E here, of how you would prioritize the terrains and think about how to value like wetlands versus mountains versus sands, things like that?
Yeah, it's now hard to always say something exact about this, but um when for each adversary, there's there's like a feeling that certain land typings and certain situations are what we want to prioritize to be able to deal with uh, in order to get ahead, really. Because there's only so much time and resources that you have for every given puzzle to be able to complete that puzzle or finish the puzzle. And so saving action economy by prioritizing stuff will give you the edge in order to finish, these puzzles in less time with less resources. So even for like the Prussia 6 setup, um, one of the biggest things that we've been kind of advocating for is there's this priority of coastal lands, back to backs, and then ravages, and then whatever else. Um, and this really, it, this is pretty general, but it more so is specific to Prussia due to its nature of being able to counter Prussia from having its stage three appear first on that first explorer.
Yep. To get jump in and just give a little bit of context here, these are generally considered to be like the golden prios, the Russia prios, where prios stands for priorities. And the nature of this comes from the fact that let's say you have a stage three into a stage two here. This stage two can have an overlapping terrain with the stage three, and even if it doesn't, you're very likely to get an overlapping terrain with the stage three because those coastal lands have their own coastal card. So, for instance, if you say start with Sands Explore here, right, on stage three, if you're very rewarded for fast controlling this explorer, because then if it re-explores on the stage two card following up, then this ravage solves itself. You don't have to invest any more actions. The explorer just dies, and you move on with your life. And you're even further rewarded if you then get a coastal explorer after, and then it kills itself during the Sands Explorer, right? But it can get a lot deeper than that, of course. For instance, I think like on board F here, land 3 can very quickly get out of control because you only have a single Dahan here and it threatens building a city. And so let's say, they explore here on turn 1 and then they build a city, then you're going to have these 3 invaders. And if you get a re-explore, suddenly, sap the strength of multitudes no longer solves this land, right? And it'll only get worse because the
Yeah,
cascades are
stage
really
two,
bad from.
7 damage.
Yeah, exactly. The cascades are really bad from this angle as well. Like if you take a blight on that first wetlands ravage and then you have to take a cascade, it's now going into land 2 and suddenly this corner's already blight locked because of the starting blight on land 4. So, it can
And
get
that could
board
also come up
specific.
a third
Yeah, that's true. It can get even darker in the timelines.
Yeah,
But um, like that's something that board E has a little bit better of a time with because you have two Dahan in this land rather than one, and if you have to cascade out of three, land 5 is generally safe. But you can see how this could be a big problem in board F. So already you can see even with regards to those Russia priorities that Ray's talking about, it can change up a little bit depending on the board. Um,
yeah, just having extra outs even for blight cascading when those lands can come up 3 times is a really big point of why you could see the benefit of the over F just now.
yeah, for sure. Um, So, one thing I want to expand on, and obviously, we've talked about this before, but the goal is to document this conversation for the audience. So, you were saying that you would prioritize certain terrains over others because it would give yourself options, it would free up actions later. Um, do you feel like you have a good example of what that would look like on board E? Like, for instance, if I were a player and I were prioritizing my wetlands, what would it look like to prioritize my wetlands? What advantage would I actually, tangibly gain from that rather than, say, focusing on that land 2 mountain because it has the scary city in it and stuff like that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Um, I think it's interesting. So to give a frame of reference, when we say wetlands are in general something to look at as prioritization over some of these other terrain types, it's a very general spoken type of thing. And when we get specific, those priorities can change between adversary and board. So putting it on board E here um, may not be so easy to see for people. I think one of the best examples is actually if we jump over to board D,
Sure,
and
yeah, let's
and
do it.
um it's going to be obvious talking about it here, but I hope that it's obvious is the goal. Because we have two wetlands on our coasts, and because coasts usually can come up multiple times, since there is a coastal stage 2 card in addition to that terrain card, which could possibly come up, and it could also be stage 1 for adversaries that have stage 1. There's a lot of pressure against um, having your wetlands resolved like on board D such that it in the case that it does come up, you're prepared and you're not caught kind of with your pants down. Especially if it's coastal when you can't deal with the three lands versus like two. But um one of the ways to play this board is not just thinking about the the current setup or whatever is just explored. Maybe it's not wetlands, maybe it's sands first. And thinking about, well, what if my card plays what if wetlands comes up next? It's going to be a problem if I'm dedicating kind of all of my early actions and tempo to solving these sands and putting everything into those and using my best powers first against those. So thinking about like, hmm, if wetlands comes up next, am I ready to deal with that, even if I expend these cards? Tends to be how I answer, why wetlands is so important into some things.
Yeah, so to kind of summarize there, just not because of, wetlands being watery for any particular reason, but it just so happens, statistically, probabilistically, that across, many adversaries, many spirits, et cetera, prioritizing wetlands generally is a better bang for your buck, you could say, with some of your important resources on your spirit. Um, is that like a
Right.
good summary of what you're saying, or do you think that
Yeah, it's always a land that is a good summary. There's some additional info on top of it, which ends up being if you don't end up taking care of the wetlands and expending too much of your resources elsewhere, a lot of the times wetlands will be one of the most dangerous lands to have built up
mhm.
if you let it go.
So I'm going to introduce a devil's advocate argument here, and I want you to shut it down, Ray. Okay? So devil's advocate argument is that when I think about like the decks, and I think about you know the fact that like Sea Monster is my favorite card in the entire game, right? Targets coastal or wetlands. To me, I'm like, well, if I just let my wetlands blight, Sea Monsters can always deal with it. Or there's always these blight removal cards that also can deal with wetlands. So if I have these cards that often can target wetlands, and wetlands is one of the most common terrain restricted card types, then why would it be then that I have to rely so much on wetlands? Can't I just rely on the deck? That's my sort of devil's advocate question here.
Yeah, it's a
Of
really good
course,
question.
of course,
Um,
we've talked about this before, but I want to sort of lay it out.
yeah, it's one of the biggest things is in a lot of these setups, wetlands isn't the most um, built up land initially. It tends to be one of the other land types, with mountains being the most. Well, wetlands a lot of the time are uh, like invaderless or nothing in them. So keeping things the way they are generally tends to be the way that you can save on action economy. Um, Especially if there are Dahan there and stuff, because they can, keep clearing themselves, or, in the case of board E, there's a blight already in one of them, and you don't want to just cascade that for no reason with very little damage. Um, so even though there are a lot of powers that focus target wetlands, that's kind of to the point of helping you prioritize clearing them because they're very minimalistic effects a lot of the time. Sea monsters being a little bit different, letting that one go. But there are ways out of the wetlands, but there are fewer ways out of the other lands.
Hmm, interesting. I think one thing that I often think about when I'm looking at the deck is because so many of these cards target wetlands, right? There's so much like wetlands focus. It can free up like precise actions to go elsewhere. But if I started by being able to solve those wetlands, then I'm gaining a boost. I'm gaining an advantage when that good RNG rolls around, rather than, as you said before, being caught with your pants down. Um,
Right.
and I think like that's a mindset, a player mindset that generally proves to be very successful. Like for instance, if I have a land that um, I'm trying to rely on some probabilistic effect to get ahead, it's much better when I'm relying on beast damage in order to solve the build rather than relying on beast damage to solve the ravage. Because when I'm using beast damage to solve the build, then I might have had some slow power or something ready to push that town out that now can control a different town. Like I can use that prime resource somewhere else. And I think with regards to like the terrain priorities in the deck, that's usually the way that I see it. Is if I play to focus the wetlands, then when that good RNG rolls around, I now can use those good resources elsewhere and really justify that because now the seed of the game has been better defined. At least that's how I like to think about it. I don't know if you feel like that's a
No, that resonates really similarly with me in that you're playing powers for multiple effects and thinking about that future of what if this gets solved for me? Because there's a lot of events and fear effects that will take care of things for you. And if they do, you want an effect that is effective elsewhere, not just on the land that you were hoping to use it on. That flexibility frees up a lot of power for players to be able to get ahead and save on resources.
Yep. I think a really good example of this actually is on board F. I think this is a really great board to analyze wetlands because board F, I think it's sort of liability land in my eyes is land 7. And that's mainly because it's not very adjacent to some of the central lands. Like you kind of have to have control of land 4 or control of land 8 in order to access it, right? Um, but so for some spirits, like they don't even start near it. They can't necessarily get to it. But it has
And
that
add
starting
on top of
beast.
that as well, if it comes up as a stage one into whatever adversary and you let it go, it's good. It has a very good likelihood of coming up in stage two and being a problem.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's so landlocked, right? And so like
Yeah.
this is a bad land, just by adjacency perspective, right? And normally, this is Prussia setup, but normally we don't have a town here. This land's empty. And this is like a very high priority land. It's a coastal land with the Dahan. We don't want the Dahan to die. Prioritizing coastal lands generally good because again, coastal lands come up a lot on stage 2. But this land has something. This is part of the reason that I think personally board F is very good. Is that one of its biggest liabilities, land 7, has a beast in it, and um, I think having a beast in a land is insane value. Actually, obviously both of us are big beast fans. But do you want to start giving like some context to the listeners about why we're sort of the opinion that beasts can be like really, really, really impactful to have as a token on your board, like why they're perhaps better than all the other tokens.
Oh man. Beasts are crazy, man. If people haven't seen it, I do have like a spreadsheet where I threw up these RNG statistics, and I also threw up some pictures of those on the Discord. But the percent chance of a beast event happening just in a positive light is 59% chance. It's more than half the time you draw an event, there will be a beast event. And
Yeah,
then to break it down a little bit further, damage, destroy explorers, push, you're looking at about 30, a little bit over 30% just to be able to do like affect the board in a positive way that could like potentially solve lands.
yeah, and that's not even including fear cards, right? Like it gets a lot
That's not
better.
even including fear cards, which also beasts have the highest percent chance of affecting a land to win.
Yeah, yeah. So it's like, I think when you put it, and of course that data, if you haven't seen it before, I'll make sure to include it in the description of this video, so you can go ahead and check out that data. And if you're really looking to like find a way to reinforce your Spirit Island gameplay, like I actually printed out this table. I'm a big nerd. I printed out this table and I put it on my wall so I can always look at it. But
It's
uh,
a really strong guiding force, honestly, and all the time that I play, I reference this and think about it. Like, what are the chances, I don't have to deal with this and sometimes gamble on it?
Exactly, exactly. And I think it's great. So again, I'll include that link in the description for people to look at. I think it's a great resource. But I think I often find myself as well trying to figure out like just how many resources I want to invest in a land I can't solve. Like for instance, okay, I have a land with an explorer and a town and two to Han. Well, I should probably throw a presence in there because adding in a presence makes it a lot more likely the land gets solved. And it's like, well, okay, if I can get a presence and a beast, is that better than getting two presents in there? I have to just check the table and then I can see that presence and beast is way better than sacred site, and all that kind of stuff. Um,
Yeah. Yeah,
and
even in that chart outlining those basic instances of like, oh, just, a presence in a land that's ravaging, Dahan that's in a land that's ravaging, is there strife? Is there a beast there? Odds just keep going up with each type of token or each type of piece that gets put in there.
Yeah, yeah, and I think like when you look at the game that way, it makes cards like swarming wasps, being cast in a completely different light because adding a beast to your board, just adding a beast to an unbladed land is valuable. It will get value at some point in the game. It's so unlikely it won't, right? But anyways, I don't
Super
want to
high
get
value.
too I don't want to get too distracted from the original topic. But the original topic is like when evaluating a board like F, adjacency wise, this land is a problem, but it also has the god token, that being the beast in land 7, which is something that you can utilize to help minimize the wetlands. Because also remember, having a beast in the land means that certain powers become a lot more impactful in that land. So, for instance, let's say you do draw swarming wasps on turn 1 and there's an explorer here, right? If you put a presence here, you can now control that explorer immediately, whereas you could not necessarily if the beast wasn't there because you wouldn't be able to target the power, you know? And like getting access to that, getting access to events, all that kind of stuff. Um, you'll notice this. You'll notice that wetlands have a lot of tools to work with. Like for instance, two boards have a beast in wetlands, and most of the time this land 3 town won't be here, so you can utilize this beast to help deal with land 3, which is also a coastal land, huge prio on board D. We've talked to death about this inland land 7 on board F. But if you even look at some of the other ones, like board E has these 2 to Han and land 8, which is super important for high tempo play and pocket oriented play. Like for instance, if you get Wetlands Explore here with Fangs, if you're able to kill this town and you are able to control this land here with a draft or something like that, like you don't even have to solve land 8. You can just let it blight and trade out, and suddenly you have a huge fat pocket, right? Especially if you control this land too, right? When I say land 2, I mean land 4 as well, and like stuff like that, I think is really, really impactful.
I want
Um,
to add on top of what you just said there, which is also noticing the beast is adjacent to that. So this is a little bit far away, but a lot of beast spirits actually like board E and F specifically because of the reason I'm going to list here, which is the beasts are adjacent to really important, like valuable lands. So if Fangs is letting 8 go, it's not spending its resources in that land, using them elsewhere to get ahead because the land can take care of itself. If it also somehow pushes a beast in that land while it's doing its other actions to get rid of, you know, the explorer in 4 and that town in 7, it has a really high chance that this land just takes care of itself, especially if you have a fear card in play. There's so much probability that, it's saved even without you interfering or spending resources on it.
right. And it's also a land that, of course, it's not great if it like totally blights and you get, like increasing aggression stage 2, into Prussia, for instance, making that land, not clear out the way that you expected, things like +1 damage in the Ravage or et cetera, stuff that could edge cases, right? If you
Yeah.
still invested your actions though in controlling 7, 6, and 4, controlling 7 is possibly the most important land to control on board E because of its like huge adjacencies and its huge centralizing inland potential, right? And so you still put your actions toward good places, even if this land doesn't work out. And most of the time, probably like 70% or higher, that land's gonna work out, you know? So, um, yeah, I think, and when you look at it, it's one of those things where it just so happens that a lot of these boards have really good tools to deal with wetlands. Like board H is a weird one because it only has 2 to Han in the coast, but you have 2 to Han here in the wetlands to counteract the starting town here in land 7. Like if you count a starting town as like -1 point and a Dahan is 1 point, this wetlands is +1 points already, just by having these 2 to Han. And board D, even though the wetlands suck because they're on the coast, you still have a beast, you still have 2 to Han, so you've got those resources to leverage. So, and I think the only boards where it gets a bit iffier for me are board A. I think is a great example of one where I don't like the wetlands so much because you have the starting Dahan in land 2 with a disease. There's many events where this disease is going to kill this Dahan. And while this Dahan here kind of encourages players to gather in from 3 in order to kill the city if wetlands comes up early. Again, you have the starting disease there, which isn't great, but now your Dahan isn't really well distributed among the coast. Like ideally, you have like 2 to Han here and like 2 to Han here, um, but that just means that your wetlands are really have nothing, and your mountains have over investment, right? Because you have a beast in 2 to Han and a coastal land, and it's not really a land that you're looking to pocket per se, right? Um, so I think this is an
It's really
example of a board I don't
yeah,
like the wetlands on.
it's really interesting though, because that's really a generalistic take on it. In general, Board A just doesn't look good in that light. But when you start seeing different matchups and stuff, and then throw a water spirit on it, like Downpour a River, they can easily get that mobility into that wetlands kind of at any point, and they could take care of something like the Scotland to what is it, city start on land 2 very easily if it were to come up first.
That's interesting. Can you give like some more specific examples or dive into that a bit more? Because I don't play Downpour that much, so it'd be
Yeah,
great for you to fill that in.
yeah, there are some opening lines that Downpour can do where it ends up saving what's it called? Dark Skies for turn 2 so that it gets some extra Dahan push and it can get the 3 Dahan into land 2 on turn 2 for the Ravage if Wetlands came up on turn 1. Um and board A is pretty famous for being the water spirit targeting board. Anything that needs to target out of wetlands, it's got
Oh, that's
the
true.
land
Land
hogs
5.
adjacent to literally everything, and they've got kind of the perfect Dahan setup storm here to just like annihilate stuff. It's one of the main instances. I know River also does similar tactics, but I'm not a huge River player, so
Interesting. Yeah,
it
that.
really, yeah, and this it's really funny when it comes up for Downpour though, because when you do that play, you also isolate like most of your lands. So not only are you covering the turn 2 Ravage and clearing your wetlands, you're covering the first stage 2 instance. So then it's gonna also prevent towns from coming in and escalating there and all this other stuff.
Oh, that's really interesting, actually. Yeah, because you know that I mostly play control spirits like Finder, Vengeance, Sunbright,
Yeah,
all that kind of stuff. And even like my Starlight per se is a more control-oriented Starlight. One of the things I hate about board A is just that like this land connection here, and like it's like a 2-lane board, right? And
that's
that's
what.
like
Yeah,
a
I know. I know.
and it's like a control spirit's nightmare, right? Because even Finder, right, they have to start here and here, and let's say you get Jungle Explore first, right? I'll just put 2 dots there. You kind of have to place your presence here, otherwise you can't get path like consistent paths value on your inland. And while you are covering 3 terrain types, which is good, it's not necessarily like where you want to be, and you don't have as great connections via things like Cirque and Paths. Like you can't really pick and choose your dump land the way on like board C. You can always get everything in land 4 into almost every adversary if you're creative enough. Or at least find ways to clear small lands and then get everything shuffled in later. Like board A, because of this like weird 2-lane system, it's just awkward. Like the adjacencies are so awkward. And
Yeah,
so,
it tends to comes down to being really, really good for spirits that can super utilize like wetlands.
hmm yeah, that makes total sense though. Because I never.
Everybody other ranges are messed up. The laning is far, like everything's far. The setups are a little awkward. Most
Yeah.
spirits are just like, I don't want to really deal with this.
Mhm. I think another interesting case is on board C here. The Wetland C5 has a starting blight in it in Tudahan. And I think this is a really interesting puzzle because if it didn't have blight there, I think people would let this land go like a lot, or they'd be willing to just eat an edge case. But like, let's say you're
Yeah,
playing Vengeance, right? On Vengeance on land 5, you start with a presence here. I'll indicate Vengeance presence with a disease for now. You start here in land 5 and in land 8, and if you get a first explorer here, right, you might be tempted to say like G3 top, play fetid, do kind of normal stuff, and then use Fiery Vengeance to clear out the town here, utilizing the Badlands Blight, right? And then you have just an explorer to the Han the Blight. But the thing is, this is, as you know, potential edge case, and you can really, really eat crap for it, right? Um, and
yeah, we keep this one.
yeah, so I think like it's an interesting puzzle because the Tahan is very useful at keeping the land clear, but it's not necessarily safe with just two Tahan and Explorer because of that blight, because it makes basically eating that edge case a lot lower EV, I would say, just because you're getting two blight instead of one. And land 8 is a land that I think can be tricky to control if you don't have good control of land 6. Like land 7 might become a dump land in many cases because it already starts with plastic and stuff like that. But you can do things like isolate this, blah blah blah, if you need to. Um, but I find that land 6 control is really important because most often like this Dahan is going here, but sometimes you might have to put it here. And if you don't have good control of land 6, then your only avenue to land 8 is usually through 7, but you don't really want to sit in 7 most of the time because that's a mountain, one of the most piled up lands, etc., etc. Um, and so, yeah, I feel like board C makes the wetlands so much more interesting than say like board E does, where I feel like 90% of the time I'm just not even playing cards on land 8, um, and I think I'm just saying that I'm just saying I appreciate the puzzle on board C. Like I think this is interesting. It's a fun board. Um,
It's the only board that has two Dahan in a blighted land as a start, which is and no two Dahan on an inland except in the blighted land. So you can't use it for these tempo sacrifices in a way.
yeah,
Would have been interesting to see more boards with that.
I think so. I mean, board D they kind of got close to it, but again, it has those two Dahan and land 7, and this Dahan and land 2. Weird spot for it for sure. Um,
Weird spot, but board D is well known as a pretty good Dahan board for
yeah,
many spirits.
yeah. I mean, one classic play for Breath of Darkness players is right. Like you get Wetlands Explore here, and you play Emerge and Terror, right, against like
Yeah.
Scotland. Double strike this, um, and then suddenly you've abducted this, and now this land's going to clear out because it has the 3 to Han. Yeah, that's like a classic play for Darkness players, for instance. But there's other analogs to this, of course. Um, Thunder Speaker can manifest this land too right away. So, and this is actually one of the only boards, like board A is the only other board that can do that with the 2 to Han and the 1 to Han and land 2. Um, so that is interesting for sure. But so we talked a lot about wetlands, but what about some of the other terrains? I think just to make sure we're moving along schedule here. Um,
True.
like we've talked about wets, but what about the extreme opposite, mountains? Do you want to start giving like kind of the mountain intro for me, Ray?
Man, mountains are like not a great terrain. There's a lot of like bad what is it, placements across the adversaries in terms of what gets put in them, and they're usually one of the lands players tend to feel they let go or let build up the most. Um, so that's kind of what they're notorious for.
Yeah, I mean, just look at Board C into Prussia, right? If you get that Sands Mountains Explorer, oh, that is that's a rough one. You know, you're getting a city here in lane 3, city here in lane 7, and that's like a lot of threat for turn 2 Ravage. Not even mentioning the fact that you have this land that's going to build up, and you have this land that's still a city explorer no less. Let's say you
Yeah.
get a coastal follow up. That's a classic edge case on board C into Prussia is like Sands Mountains into coastal, and I feel like a large part of that is the mountains. Um, but there's other boards that I think it's even worse on. Like on
Yeah.
board H, it can get really scary, even though you have a beast here, or on board like F into Sweden.
This
Uh,
is actually, yeah, before jumping around real quick, I want to point out something, which is if you notice on board H, E, and A, there's mountains that are adjacent to each other 3 times on these boards, and that tends to not be a very good thing. You don't want two lands ravaging to essentially be next to each other. You want space between them. Um, in terms of being able to shift either pieces, tokens, not having to be in them and or be in one of them and cover other land types. They're very locked in terms of like ranges to be able to target various types of powers or have various types of plays against them, especially if you're trying to like let one go and not and save the other.
Yeah, can you go into that a little bit more? Because, like, here's the devil's advocate argument is like, oh, well, I could put a presence here in land 5, right? And I'm not only controlling a blighted land, I'm also controlling every land on the board except for these two. But these two have like 3 Dahan among them. So, Ray, I
Right,
think you are full of doo doo. Can
you
you.
think I'm full of doo, right? Yeah, because that only covers range 1 abilities. If you wanna get rid of all range 0 abilities, you've certainly done that with that placement, right? So
Exactly.
and sometimes spirits really a lot of the time, not even just some of the time, utilize those range 0 powers, you need to be in that land. And having to place that in say, board H mountains, you're gonna lose a lot by placing a presence over there. Because
Yeah.
not you don't always have the opportunity to place in land 5. Of course, it's like golden, and you're not dealing with range 0 powers, but you lose access to a lot of great things like what is it? Domesticated, Carapace, Sap without air, um, and Gold Allure only pulls in from like less lands on H because they're so like adjacent to each other. Whereas if
Hmm.
they're more spread out, Gold Allure has a lot more value of what it's hitting.
Yeah, I totally agree there. I think like a mental proxy for thinking about this is imagine if whatever terrain you're thinking about is like a volcano starting presence land, right? Like
Yeah.
volcano would hate this. If you
Yeah,
had to deal
exactly, like, why is this that volcano? That's a great, analogy.
Whereas, like board E, at least controlling this central mountain is still useful, but controlling, like, say, the land 2 and the land 5 mountain isn't enough to cover these two lands. Like, you're always missing out on two terrains, right? Like, even on board F, this land 4 mountain is incredible for covering this and also stuff on other boards, right? But you're still
Yeah,
missing out on land 1 and land 2, you know? And, uh, and that's again being generous and assuming range 1 powers from from mountains and stuff like that. But also, I think another thing to point out, and I'd actually like to shift gears a little bit here pretty soon, if you feel like that's okay,
sure.
is a lot of the powers just aren't kind to mountains. Like like for instance, two of the terrain specific powers that deal with mountains, or not deal with, but like address mountains, are not particularly great. We put them in the not great category. Um,
Yeah,
but like when you consider all the options that say like Wetlands has, and you compare it to some of the very few good options that are good for mountains, like say Purifying Flame, this is a really good option for mountains because it's got amazing elements, and Blight Removal is great because if mountains are going to build up, then Blight Removal is kind of like a delayed skip. It's a good way to address that. Same with Teeming Rivers, it's another great power. Um, but yeah, I mean, compare that to a lot of the other ones here, and I just feel like mountains are kind of getting the short end of the stick. You want to start diving into these minor powers and kind of nerding out a bit? Um,
yeah, mountains, I had written stuff down. especially with playtesting as well. And mountains kind of to get the short end of the stick here. It does have two blight removals, which kind of play into its role of, yeah, if I let this build up and let it go, the solution that's out there is the blight removal. There's not really good ways to deal with the land other than the blight removal powers. And most of the time that is how we deal with the mountains. So it's unless you've got a lot of tempo, a lot of fast control and stuff, your set of solutions are very, very limited compared to some of the other stuff. Um, sands have purifying flame as well, but they're also less often built up across the adversaries. They start kind of pretty clear, so it gives you a little bit more leeway with stuff like ooze, ants, pull beneath. Renew also works on there. Desiccating winds for even damage spirits. Like across all the powers, mountains has like the least for damage spirits, and damage is already a pretty niche strategy. So like, if you are a damage spirit, all the other land types are going to give you more various flexible solutions to go after.
Yeah, I think that's a good overview for sure. And like one specific example I want to draw out is, um, there are some cards that are more tempo oriented cards, like Defense, for instance, where it's just not even equal. Like for instance, let's look at Dark Entangled Woods and Drift Down into Slumber, right? So like it's not even close here, right? Drift Down's a zero cost card, and Dark Entangled Woods is a one cost card, which maybe something that we should talk about a little bit, like why we feel like zeros are so powerful in this game for econ reasons. But also, if you look at the actual effect, you're trading here fear for higher defend, but and larger range. But 99% of the time, having higher defend and larger range and a more important element than Moon is going to be generally more useful at covering more situations than that two fear is. And so, just to cover a little bit of some kind of stuff that I haven't covered quite yet on this channel because finders and major powers focus spirits. So I haven't nerded out about the powers yet. Um, why don't I talk about real quick, just like very very short summary of like energy econ, one cost versus zero cost, what goes between there, and then Ray, if you want to just talk about the elements real quick, of like why my first impression is that this air is more useful in the moon, that'd be great. So I'm gonna go first here. So going first, I think the way to think about costing with cards, especially minor powers, is that one cost minor powers do not cost one. They actually cost something like 4 or 5 energy because you're going to be playing this card multiple times throughout a game, most of the time, right? And every time you play it, it's incurring its cost again. Every time you play Drift Down, it doesn't incur any more cost. So over the course of the game, you could have played one more important major, for instance, by not picking Dark Entangled Woods, or multiple minor powers by not picking Dark Entangled Woods over taking something like Drift Down because it's a zero cost. And additionally, the fact that zero costs are always playable and never hurt your econ really affects your spirit build. So, for instance, if I'm playing something like Vengeance, right? Vengeance here, I'm just going to show it on screen for the viewers. Vengeance here has kind of restricted tracks. Like the earliest kind of functional energy econ to place econ you can get to is 2/2. And you could get that with an early G2 or a double G3. I'm personally a double G3 fan, but just because I like drafting. Um, but like, let's say you're at 2 energy and 2 card plays. If you play 2 1 cost cards, then every turn you're out of energy. But if you play 2 0 cost cards, you're accumulating energy, you're gaining energy. And you can stockpile that energy to help pay for events, pay for major powers. You can then afford to slot in more 1 costs that you want. But if your hand is all 1 costs, you just can't even play all the cards. So that's just one thing I wanted to go over in case the viewers were not familiar with that yet, because that's something that I think I would go over in future spirit guides. And Ray, if you want to take a turn at describing the elements, like why even just this one element difference is significant, that'd be great. Um,
Yeah, so just summarizing, you're going over like the total economical impact throughout the game, like a one cost could have against a zero cost.
mhm.
Yeah, it's a lot. It changes up. plans and what spirits can do entirely. Same with these elements. It's elements are a funny thing, actually. Air being more valuable than moon, um, is mostly due to the major deck synergizing air with air pretty well.
Hmm.
Because both have events, um, in the event deck that you kind of wanna take care of, moon being new species, air being what is it?
Rising interest.
Interest, yeah.
Yeah.
Rising interest, probably a little bit more important to pay for most of the time than the new species. You can kind of get away with new species a little bit. Um, but most of the moon powers are either higher cost or too hard to threshold for most spirits, or don't require their threshold plain outright. So the moon becomes much less valuable if you are trying to consider a major power strategy. And then, air very abundant, but will synergize with like some of the really great picks over here. I know Irresistible is one of them. We've got Flock,
Yeah, I'm just picking out a couple here.
Voice.
A couple random examples I just picked out from the major deck, and I know you're looking at the pile over there. Give me a sec to reset
Yeah,
the
yeah.
deck here. Um, I didn't even go too deep in the deck. Like I just picked a couple cards. But
Air's on a lot of stuff. I mean, and you can flex it with so many different things. Generally,
so this is an example of a card that's bad, right? And
fair.
it's a 4 moon threshold, right? So like if you spec for moon, sure, you're gonna be able to threshold terrifying nightmares. That's great. 4 fear is great, but like remember that 4 fear comes for free on paralyzing fright, which is the same cost card, and it is skip all, right? So that's like one of the most important effects in the game and scaling into high difficulty content. Um, and so like this is just one example of why specking for moon is not great. But then like air is just often I think a secondary tertiary element on very many important majors. So here I even just picked up majors that I don't even think are that like cracked per se, but just the air is really important. Like pyroclastic is most limited by air if you're trying to get that extra damage. Wrapped, you're gonna need air for it. Things like Storm Swath is an important card to be able to threshold because of its huge value in threshold. Um, Voice of Command is like a really, really broken threshold if you can hit it. Um, Flocking, being able to basically play the entire power again. Even if you stock up on air a ton, you're able to threshold Weave, which is, I think, an underrated threshold. Like, that is a really good threshold because you're essentially isolating 2 lands and removing 2 cities. Um, Stuff like
Bombard
that.
and Irresistible are also really
Oh,
phenomenal
yeah.
for
100.
tying it back in. I think like mountains pretty much get the short end of the stick, even on powers here. Like the range plays a big deal too, because two range is most of the ranges across most boards. There are some exceptions where it's range 3 between lands on certain boards,
Hmm.
but drift down just having that flexibility means it's likely one less presence placement that you need, which either enables a lot of spirits that don't grow with presence on their reclaim to like enable looping, or enables more hits if you do go Blighted Island and you get Presence Destruction, Blighted Island effect. That Drift Down's getting more leverage, the more presence you get rid of rather than Dark Entangled.
Yeah, I totally agree here. Um, and like even just stats wise, like all the mount. I don't think there's a zero cost mountain card, right? Am I
Uh,
missing something? I don't think it exists.
it's Gold's Allure.
Oh, okay. But Gold's
Like
Allure, right? It's kind
it
of
goes against the benefit of Gold's Allure is if the mountains are adjacent to stuff, which board A and board H effectively kill.
right. But also, Gold's Allure is one of those cards that leans into the mountain strategy of let's pile more crap there. And
Yeah.
like to be
Half
honest,
half like the strife ends up getting worthless too in that point.
I was
Still a good card.
yeah, I was about to say the same thing. Like I think most of the time when I'm playing Gold's Allure, I'm just using it as basically a zero cost like calls to like, you know? And
So
like
so Yeah, the one rare occasion that I've gotten it to work with Strife is, like, when playing Wildfire and you're keeping your board clean, and you can actually utilize board F mountains or something.
Yeah, that's a good example. Good example. Or even just like being able to
Right,
have strife into France or something like that. Just something very basic, you know.
right.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. And like, so even though Gold's Allure is like an amazing card because it's multi-land, it's gather, and it is a zero cost. That's kind of the only thing mountains
Oh,
have
Duke
going for
Treasure
them. And again, they don't. It doesn't prioritize clearing the mountains. Like that strife is kind of wasted, in our opinion, at least. Um, and so yeah, it's like even when Mountain starts to win in the deck, it kind of doesn't win in a way that clears the land. The only fast tempo is Tretch, which is, I'm really glad you pointed out. There's also Disorienting Landscape. Um,
is a one cost though, but this is the other
yeah.
zero that targets mountains, which most of the time, funny enough, is still used on
Yeah, I think most of the time you're using Tretch on Wetlands. Like, board E, they explore in land 4, and you use Tretch to push out the Explorer. Like,
'Cause
that's.
if you even just look at Prussia's setup right now, the mountains have some in it. This goes, like, across multiple setups, but you can't even use stretch there. Like, you got E, B, H, and C. I guess, like, 4 of the boards with mountains with stuff in them on the coast, in lands that you really want to control.
Yeah,
It's
it's
actually
like.
cool.
I feel like the only board here where I think Tretch is getting huge value in Mountains is board A, right?
Yeah.
Um, and there it's getting even bigger value because you can elect to put down the wilds on a turn that a mountains hasn't even come up yet. Which having a wilds on your board is not only good for playing into high tempo, but also good into preventing a very specific edge case, that being sprawl. Right? Am I remembering that right? Or is it map makers? I can't remember. There's one
The
or
map
two
maker's
events.
ignoring the wilds.
Yeah, I think I can't remember.
Map ignores the wilds, but you don't get an extra explore for it.
Right. And so just having one wilds on your board, even if it's not doing anything, is shutting down a pretty, I would say, swingy event for a lot of spirits. But anyways, that's kind of nerding out a bit too much. But yeah, I think certainly if you look at some of these cards, like Invested Aquifers and Prowling Panthers and Song of Sanctity, like, oh, the mountains. It's like mountains. I mean, you get jungles here a little bit too, but at least jungles have some really nice tools like Drift Down and what else am I thinking? Shadows of Burning Forest, which is also a mountain card, so maybe we shouldn't be too harsh, but um,
But that does require that extra presence, range 0 presence in those mountains.
it does, and certainly I think that the major deck favors jungles a lot more over mountains. I mean, you have like some of the best cards in the game, like Tiger's Hunting is literally a jungle card. So, um, but yeah, um, so I think also, we have separated out these powers here in terms of ones that target terrains, but there's a lot of powers here that don't necessarily. There's things like Call to Guard, Nature's Resilience, which have no terrain restriction at all, Entrancing Apparitions, or even here are the maybe monsters. And so I think to round out our discussion of the minor power deck a little bit better, we should kind of pick a topic here and start diving into it. I think. So what is drawing you the most right now, Ray? What do you want to dive into that's not terrain discussion?
It's not terrains.
We could do Dahan
Hmm.
positioning, could do tokens, could do there's a lot of cool options, I think. There's control cards. I think the control cards can be really interesting to talk about. Totally not biased.
Tokens is a pretty interesting one as we're getting into it a little bit with like beasts and disease and where the blight is placed.
Yeah. I mean, we certainly have gone over like things like swarming lusts on board F, having that huge, fast control option on F7. Um, what about start picking some random powers here. Let's say that you got here there may be monsters, hazard spread, strong and constant currents, and cycles in your draft. let's say you got those four cards, Ray. What are already
Mhm.
some of your like deep nerdy thoughts about about just seeing those cards? Let's say you're on board B, you know? You see those cards. Like what are things that start going through your head?
Let's pull out the cards so it's a little bit easier for people to
Yeah, good call, good call.
let's throw them on like board B.
Yeah, so I think I said hazards, cycles, here there may be monsters, and shoot, I forgot what the last one was.
Strong and constant.
Yeah. So I'm giving you the benefit of giving you three zero costs and
Mhm.
one very strong one cost, so that the costing isn't quite so much part of the discussion. It's part of why I chose these cards, but like, let's just think about how being on board B affects the
Mhm.
way you look at this draft.
Yeah, it's it's hard to detach the spirit from this, in all honesty. But um, with board B in particular, a lot of the time when I'm playing it, I actually bisect this board as well. There's kind of like the Southlands and like the Northlands,
Mm-hmm.
which the North being the more inland for whatever reason. um, and then yeah, there's like that kind of segmenting makes it really interesting because it causes a lot of like turmoil if you wanted to have range one sacred site powers. Um, if you were considering utilizing range one sacred site powers, because generally you would want a sacred site in land four so you can one range against all your coast, but this doesn't reach land eight. So you'd need another sacred site somewhere within the Northlands, um, compared to the Southlands. But it's one of the reasons why like the board ends up being like a bisect. So even though hazards is range two, this is one of those situations where it doesn't actually hit everything when you determine where like the highest value sacred site would end up being, which is generally land four.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of what I see with hazards. There's value in all the tokens and everything, but that's generally that. Strong and constant currents has okay value. You would initially kind of look at land three and be like, look, there's a town. I can, control this with strong and constant currents. But if you take a minute to pause, you need a range zero presence in that land to do that. And if you
Mm-hmm.
put the range zero presence in there, your one range options are very limited compared to now you're three range away from land eight.
I'm so glad that you started talking about this because this is one of the reasons I threw these cards in the choice is because I wanted to create some kind of light traps. I think a lot of people look at a card like Strong Constant Currents and rightfully so think it's an incredible card. It is an incredible card. It's generally very useful. But on board
Literally
B,
a really amazing card.
right, generally a very amazing card, but on board B specifically, it totally changes that story. This is why I wanted to include it in the example. So I'm really glad that you hit on that. I'm just commenting that.
It,
Um,
yeah, it's it's definitely a fun one to see. And I mean, we don't have the explorers here, we don't have the spirit here and everything, so you're losing a little bit of like elemental value and what the explore could potentially be solved. But in just the initial case of wanting to prevent that city, which is definitely high value, there's a lot of sacrifice in order to kind of utilize that. Here There Be Monsters is kind of an interesting one. It's actually pretty useful on board B, but it's also um very tight on your resources. Your resources being like your presence and your card plays, because it doesn't actually do too much and kind of is a slow power. It it needs to be planned out to be used in a very specific area at range zero. There's no flexibility if, like, say mountains were building and we had an explorer there.
mhm.
I throw a guy there. And like we're like, oh yeah, we could just grow in there, place a presence there, and here there be monsters it for whatever reason. It's a good plan. But a lot of the times explorers do get taken care of by events, fear effects. If you did happen to get a beast in there or something and it took care of it, now your Here There Be Monsters plan is gone, and there's no flexibility with how you can utilize that. other than having your presence globally spread throughout the inland lands to be in effective areas, if they
Yeah,
are even
yeah.
effective at that time. So, like, the more stipulations that I keep putting onto this, you're like, "Man, that's a lot of things to think about." It is.
Yeah,
It
no.
ends up playing out that way. Um, even though, like, some cards could offer more flexibility at higher costs or something, like, that is a real concern.
Yeah, I think
And
that's a huge point. Because Here There May Be Monsters, I think is a card that, in my opinion, is a little underrated. Like I think it can be used pretty well, and that element combo can be tough to get a hold of, especially for spirits like Darkness. Like getting that on a zero cost is insane. Um, but And it's good fear as well. Like generally 2 to 3 fear from a zero cost control power, like that's solid. But on board B, it is a little bit weird because again, board B really demands that land 4 control just because of adjacencies. And as you said, it doesn't lean into that style of play we were talking about earlier, where like you do something that has an intention, and then when the game hands you like a golden ticket to cheat, right? Like, oh, we destroyed an explorer for you or whatnot. Like now you can
right,
use that leverage somewhere else, and you can't with Here Where There May Be Monsters on this board, at least not as well. And so I feel like
yeah,
these two cards, even though they're generally pretty good, don't see quite as much love on board B. Now, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of boards where these cards I think are much better. Like I actually think on board C, Here There May Be Monsters usually has really good uses. Even Strong Constant Currents can have good uses on board C. Um, or we're on board E. What's another good one? Ironically, because of how screwed up the adjacencies are on board G, I think Here There May Be Monsters get some value because you kind of have to spread out sometimes with certain spirits. But that aside, like these two cards are already cards that if I'm on board B, right, I'm biased toward thinking about, because even though this board is bisected in the way that you said, Hazard Spread can still cover a wide range of lands, and
right,
specifically, if I'm willing to pay for this as a 1 cost, which sometimes I am, I can get a disease and land 1 or something like that, stop a build, and it's like, obviously that can get edge cased, but that's like a solid play. Or even just making sure that I have a beast in land 1 or a beast in land 4, or if I'm like a strife spirit and I want to copy a strife that I had from land 3, like a fear card, and put it into land 2, like I think it has very good options on the coast, and moderately
Hazards
good
plays into a
options.
lot of. Yeah, I want to touch on that Hazards also plays into free action economy. So something Here There Be Monsters does is that it it is the value of itself, in that you're saving a little bit of resources in the long run because it's 0, which is great, but it doesn't give you flexibility. Because it doesn't give you the flexibility to use it elsewhere, you're not able to capitalize off gaining free action economy that the events and fear cards can give you. Whereas hazards, there's a lot of strife events and everything, and there's a lot of like extra beast events. With the beast events are the highest odds, right? So if you place those anywhere, you get free wilds. There's board adjacent wilds. You just keep throwing those on your board anyway. You're just piling up the extra freedom that it's giving you, or utilizing it.
For sure. Yeah, I totally agree. And, even something like cycles here on this board, I actually really like cycles on board B. And the reason being is because the board is bisected, as you said. Um, it leads to a very I mean, I think a lot of players would disagree with me on this, but I think it leads to a very lazy play style on board B, because it means you can let land 1 go, you can let land 2 go, and just remove Blight there as much as you need. And like it lets you focus then on the Northlands and really like try and rein that in so that you're not as split, right? You have like one card that just basically defeats 2 through 3 coastal problems. You look to defend this or something, and then you're really focused on cleaning up the Northlands here, and then suddenly one of the biggest, I would say honestly, problems about board B is that it's bisected, is something that's mitigated by taking a cycles draft. So it goes beyond just like this card's good at dealing with coast, and like it'll be good at dealing with coast on any board, but because of the layout of board B, it enables a different philosophy for how you play the board, you know?
Exactly, like, that bisecting really showcases why cycles can completely take care of most of those southern areas, and you can also notice that it's bisected by a land that has a blight, so you don't wanna cascade into it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, that's another subtlety here. And like, even just like other things aside, like cycles is a one cost, yeah, but like you can afford to take a couple one costs, a couple good one costs in your game. And I think this is one where like it's so strategy shaping, I would definitely go for it. It's also covering some important events, missionaries, years of little rain. Like I know people don't really draft for years of little rain because generally people have enough water, but like when you don't actually hit the prolif on years of little rain, it's painful, man. Like those games are so painful.
One prolif is you're walking through the gates to heaven there.
Yeah, for sure. Um, and yeah, so thanks for going through this draft with me on board B. I think that was a really fun discussion there. Um, and it's just I think like this board's video like there's just so much, right? Like we could do this with any draft. We could pick like random four cards, random board, and get into why on that board it starts getting interesting. Um,
Right.
and I kind of like encourage the viewers to go home and do the same. Like get your friends in on a Discord call, you sit there and just think about some of these drafts. And I think, at least for me, I feel like I play a lot better with this stuff in mind. I think it definitely helps my game. But with that in mind, one thing that I think was really important in discussion on board B was the fact that we were able to determine that bisection, right, and determine like basically the adjacency science on board B, and that's one thing that we haven't really talked about at all yet. So maybe we can shift gears there and come back to major powers a little bit later. But do you want to start talking about like? Do you want to draw some diagrams on each board for me, Ray? About how you feel like the boards are kind of divided, the flow of the boards as you were sort of describing it.
Oh, it's yeah, that's definitely gonna be interesting. Um, I'll try to do what I can. I
Yeah,
know the board B philosophy is one of the most what's the right word?
well
Easy
defined.
to easy to
Yeah,
tell.
yeah. But I think I'll help you out a little bit here too. I think this.
There's something about that. There's like
I guess if this is north and south, then this would be west and east. I'll go ahead and do that. Oh yeah, board H has that weird, definitely that weird division. Um,
this is what I see when I see board H, which
yeah,
is
yeah. Oh, and then board G. Gosh, we're gonna have to talk about the disaster that is board G at some point. I'm just gonna do like a little sun here because this I think is already showing a lot of the problem. Um,
yeah.
this will be the little Northland. Um, yeah, and I think another division I'm gonna add here on F is this one. Um,
Yeah,
because
sometimes.
yeah, sometimes that I think can be a division. Or maybe instead of doing it the way I did it there, I'm gonna throw it here. But there's also very
It's not even
interestingly
so much like
this division.
dissecting boards between regional differences. It's like the way that I'm looking at it is for certain things to look out for a lot of the time. But I
Yeah,
can't
yeah.
really explain why I drew the lines like that.
And I'll explain my lines as well, for sure. I think this is great for board E. I'm also just gonna do the any lands that have like very critical adjacencies. I'm gonna do this. I think land 7 on board E is just so important to control. I guess board A we talked about land 5 a little bit. Let's see. Board C is kind of interesting because there is like land 7 in its connections. There's also land 4. I think oftentimes I see land 7 and
Or
land
see,
4 separate.
land five is like the key land to be in.
Yeah, I think that one's definitely separate. Um, yeah, all right. Maybe we should talk about some of these doodles because I think a lot of players, when they're picking a board, and certainly, I used to play this way a lot until, I think some discussion sparked me to kind of think about it a little bit differently, consider some other options. I used to just pick things that just, had very high adjacencies from starting presence. And like that's good, right? Being in a land that's adjacent, as you said, being a wetland spirit on board A is great because you're adjacent to so many options already, and that's a good starting position. But like
Right.
I think it's important, even if you're, say, on board E and you start, like, I don't know, here and here. No spirit starts that way, but if you did, I think it would still be important to kind of move into land 7 and try to control it, as quickly as you could because of how important that land is. It's almost like as if you wish your start was on land 7. Um, and But there's also these kind of regions that we're describing, right? And I think they're lands that just often have interplay with each other. Like if you're pushing buildings in and out of those lands, like they're often going to other lands that are within the same region. Like you're very rarely getting things to kind of cross regions, and if they do, then the kind of balance of pieces in those regions is now upset, right? Like for instance, if you're
Mhm.
on board A and all of your plastic is in lands like 4, 5, and 7, and none of your plastics in these lands, then suddenly if you start pushing stuff out, like that would feel bad because now this lane that requires a whole different set of tools than this lane now has, more plastic in it than it should, right? And stuff like that. So I'm just kind of explaining a little bit what these divisions mean so that they're not just like, these very loose kind of like, oh, I feel like the board's divided here for whatever reason kind of thing. I'm trying to explain a little bit, you know, um, why we gravitate toward these divisions. So I think on board A, we've definitely covered some of the aspects of it already. The fact that this board really has two lanes. You don't see a lot of cross interaction, I think, between the two lanes. Like you rarely see stuff getting pushed, from here to here or here to here, like back and forth. Like either you want certain things in this land or certain things in this land, et cetera, and they kind of stay there, at least for control spirits. Um, but even just adjacency wise, right? Like if you're in land 5, you're already controlling basically this whole land, like this whole lane. Also, if you're in lane 4, you're basically controlling, this whole lane. And like sure you have, range 1 adjacency to this stuff, but you don't have the same benefit, I think, of, having, access to this part of this board that's over here, in a multiplayer context, or um certainly like this requires a very different set of powers to address because this is a sand, like double sands and a wetlands, which plays very very differently, with very little Dahan, sorry, a lot of Dahan, I meant to say, most of your Dahan are in this lane, versus like double mountains, very unfavorable mountain setup, a kind of unfavorable jungle setup here with a starting inland towns kind of in a gross spot. I think this lane is very different. And I think we've also talked about board B in quite a lot of detail. But let's go into C and D here, starting with C. So I've kind of made my division here, and you can totally see my finder bias at play, right? Because these two lands are really important for finder. Um, but do you want to talk about a little bit why you're cutting things off here, and also that land 5 control? Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, land 5 is a pretty central land. It hits most of your stuff at range 1. And when we're thinking about these adjacencies and bisects, a lot of the times spirits are only able to do range 0 and range 1 stuff, or that's what you really want to do. Range 2 is requires a little bit more planning. It's a little less often visible or found. Um, or it's just on specific cards, so they get so most of the time it would be for those 0 and 1 powers. Land 5 gives a lot of leverage if that's what, we're contextualizing it to. But why I bisected 8 and 7 is a lot of the time, even with control spirits, those are the lands because our centralized land with range 0 and range 1s ends up being 5. It means we also need additional placements over in either 4 or 3, um, to be able to or in 2 to be able to gain access to 3 because it's one of our most dangerous coastal lands. So lands, as a consequence of wanting to be over there on board C and having prime location, prime real estate location. 7 and 8 do tend to get built up. And there's not many outs for where that can go except to each other and land 6. So something that's very critical to pay attention to is controlling and how you control land 8 and 7 in games when you're on board C, in addition to being in the other very high value locations.
Yeah, I think that's a really good explanation. And another thing as well is to highlight some kind of your, thing on land 5. Like we've already talked about land C5, but we haven't even mentioned the fact yet, and this is super important, that when you're sitting in lands that have Dahan, you are constantly farming Dahan events. There's events that give you free energy, give you reclaims, give you minor power drafts if you have enough Dahan. And like controlling, say land 5 because it's so important because you don't want it to get edge case because of that blight and because it's so central is you're basically rewarded for doing it on top of that because you're farming all those Dahan events at the same time. That's kind of a little thing that I think we definitely forgot to mention, so I'm just kind of fitting that in there now. And I really like the
That
way you described as well about the outs of the land. I agree that like the lands you've divided here kind of have outs to each other, but not as many outs to the rest of the board. I mean, especially if you think about like land 7 to 5 out, that's just not an out, non-existent because of the starting blight. So unless you get, I think it's like far off wars or something. Nah, not that. There's an event that removes the blight here, but ethereal
yeah,
conjunction. Yeah, that's it. That's it.
usually you don't want to push into coastals either for the most part, and that beast is a lot of the time controlling out to land 7 because you don't want to throw it in land 5 blight. You don't want to throw it into
Right.
land 3 if 3 up. 7 gets it's the pile up.
Yep. And that's also again leaning into the role of mountains from the minor power deck as well. So it just makes natural sense when you get that like you have a town here and then the event is like push a town from a land with a beast, like it's going here most of the time, for all the reasons that we've described, and I think that's really important to highlight for sure. Um,
Just touching on those reasons really lightly again, you don't want to put it into coast just because coast can come up multiple times with that land type. So it's more dangerous if like you end up not being able to deal with them or they blight and then they come up 1 or 2 more times depending on, stage 1 coastal and their stage 2 card. That's
yeah,
one of the big ones. The other big one is, if land 2 comes up a bunch and and it builds towns and you push another town in there, that's a whole nother city that if that comes up again, you now need to deal with instead of ending the game with just the one city because it would have built a town instead if you didn't push it there. That's
yep.
like a really common thing that ends up happening.
Yep. And as hopefully the finder experts in my viewer audience will know and remember from my finder guide, like I've explained a lot about how you really want to avoid dumping in coastal lands as a control spirit, because it doesn't give you many outs. It just gives you more edge cases. That's all it is. Is like you get higher probability of explore screwing you up. You get a higher probability of like a bad event screwing you up, higher probability, like things like diaspora. Like I would much rather not diaspora from a coast because it's going to have to hit other coastal lands, right? Whereas from an inland, at least most of the lands it's hitting are other inland lands, so at least it's not near the coast. And I think also just like you have to consider the case that you can't solve that land and you have to come back to it later. As Ray said, like building that extra city in the end game like makes that end game win condition a lot harder. You know, um, and like if you let this land go and it just happened to blight and you're like, all right, I'll kill the city later, and you only have like 5 damage, like, oh well, boo-hoo, because you push this town here from the beast event, like you now have to deal with the fact you have an extra city here and all that kind of stuff. So I think that's a really great example, Ray, and I'm just like highlighting some other aspects too. um, so yeah, I think board C. I love board C a lot, but gotta avoid dumping into land 2. And I think this division you put, and this division I put here is mostly for finder players. It's just because land 4 ends up being really centralizing, and so 7 and 4 end up becoming outs rather than 7 and 8. Um, and so that's kind of just like a finder specific thing. I think raised division makes more sense across the board. So just to make a little comment there. With regards to board D, this is interesting, Ray, because I would have done the division like this. And I'm really curious. I want to hear your thoughts. I want you to justify this.
I mean, your centralized locations to hitting stuff are being in Land 5, Land 2, Land 3, Land 1. This board requires almost every turn to be planned around what if coasts and what if wetlands show up. If they didn't explore this turn, what if they come up next turn? And you really want to be in locations that can cover those and handle those and have those situations suited. A lot of the time, because coastal and wetlands barrage, as we know, there's a meme in the community called the Board D Special or the
Oh
BDS,
man, the
which is if
board
you
D
constantly
special.
get wetlands, jungles, wetlands, coastal, wetlands, jungles, like just back-to-back barrages of just those land types. Um, and it happens pretty often.
Like,
Very funny enough.
yeah.
When playing Board D.
I mean, for instance, into Scotland, you can really get a nightmare, right? You can get jungles into wetlands stage one, then wetlands stage two, so you get the back to back, or you could get jungle stage two into wetlands, and then jungle wetlands stage three, and then coastal, right? So it's like
Yeah,
relentless pressure on this land three here, right? Because at least this land one is clearing itself out over and over, but like dang, is that land three annoying? And it's so separated from the rest of the board. Imagine if you're like a roots player, and you have to deal with this. That's so awful, right? Because your Incarna's going to be going over here. It's going to be going over here, like constantly, because here it's really important with Radiant to be able to cover this land, right? And then here it's important with Radiant, but then you can't really Radiant because you're probably not Terra level 2. And then, like, you're just going to be relying on a lot of Vitality, but then with Vitality, like, you're going to be wanting to place here and here a lot, but you're gonna have to do it like every turn, so you're reclaiming a lot. You're not drafting. Like that's such a nightmare. That's just one
right.
spirit example. Um,
So yeah, those are pretty much like that's a major part of why you want to be in some of these locations. The Sands is also good to be in to an extent um because it's a very important land to be in control when you can, but a lot of the times I've noticed 4, 6, 7, and 8 are the lands that end up being built up and not taken care of simply because of how like overwhelming wetlands and jungles can be when they come up. But everything else can be kind of flexibly let go. You know, you can defend 7, you can let 4 go, you can defend both, you can plan to let 6 go, take care of 2 because it's, your coastal priority over there. You can let 8 go, 5 is your blighted land. These lands are what tend to build up and kind of get taken care of the least from what I've seen, which is something to always kind of consider, which is why I've bisected it this way. It's like, yeah, these are going to be my problem lands most of the time, as long as I'm thinking about wetlands, coast, and how to really take care of those situations.
Yeah. And also, like, if you think about that, right? Like, this goes into why, board, further reasons why board D can be a really challenging board is because, like, that land 8, right, wants to build up and blight the way you just described. But then land 8, let's say land 8 blights, right? You get a blight in there, and, it maybe had, like, I don't know, town city or something like that. And then this
Yeah,
had, like, explorer, and then this, like, re explores, right? Now you have two mountain blighted lands that are demanding your attention away from the wetlands and the jungles, right? That you generally want to focus on. And so
yeah,
it's very dangerous because the board leans you into playing this way because you kind of have
yep,
to, but then you get these kinds of explores and it's brutal. I mean, for spirits that don't
yeah, and
have
not
like
and believe it or not, it's actually hard for a lot of spirits to do the growths that they want to do and also get into land 8 if they're not already starting kind of high up there or have the range 1 into them.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like, also, a lot of spirits just have really bad starting setup for dealing with that kind of situation. Like, let's say you're not even playing Prussia 6, right? So you're just like, oh yeah, I normally play against level 6, and it's so simple. What if I play against Prussia 5 for once? It's like Many Minds, right? Many Minds is starting here. If you get like mountains into mountain wetlands, into
This is
uh
one of those mini minds nightmare boards, man. Range 4 away from your start.
Yeah, so like mountains into like mountain
Three.
wetlands into like coast into mountains or something like that. What a terrible, terrible situation for many minds, which is an insanely strong spirit and normally does very well into Prussia, right? And is now like this S tier spirit is struggling against not even a level 6 adversary just because of the board layout, you know? And it's part of it is from their start, but part of it is also just even if they did start like right here or right here, which would be a lot more preferable for dealing with this, I still think it would be pretty difficult because you're basically demanding certain expectations from the player with the way these adjacencies are working. Um, and, you know, again, like that attention being put into land 8, that attention is not adjacent to anything important other than land 1, right? So it's the board's
It
kind of
it's
distracting
something
you.
a lot of people aren't. Yeah, it's something even with the many minds example, it's really interesting because it also enforces people to play in a way that they're really unfamiliar with. Like the way to deal with this situation is to G3 start. And most people don't play that way. They really prefer the G2, starts on many minds.
Yeah,
So
for sure.
it's gonna be an unorthodox play style for the player, and then they're not gonna have familiarity with what to do next now that they did that even because they're gonna be playing in a completely different tempo than they're used to.
For sure. But, you know, of course, we're talking about how powerful these boards are. If you care about fun, there could be some really interesting puzzles in those kinds of games, you know? Like, for instance, I remember for the longest time, like, I didn't really enjoy Towering Roots of the Jungle in Nitrous Incarnate. And a lot of that was due to the fact that I was playing on really powerful boards. Like, on board E, Roots is super, super strong because you delete this town in the slow of turn 1 and you have like amazing inland control. Like you almost always are able to pocket turn 1, and suddenly your Vital is just perfect for covering coasts. You can place Presence Coast to defend, clear out. Like you just have so many options, natural advantage on board E. But like board D is a bad board for Roots. It's Roots' worst board. But I actually think because of these kind of unconventional lines, it ends up being one of the funnest boards for Roots. And it was actually I think the board that got me to appreciate Roots a lot more because I remember I think you remember this as well. You were there. Like I went to Red and I was like, Red, I
Yeah,
don't know, I'm just not enjoying Roots, right? And Red was
we
like,
were talking through it.
and Red was like, "Oh, you just got to play board D, man. Like, just play Roots on board D." And I was like, "Okay." And you know, like Red. When I refer to Red, I mean Red Revenge. You know, he's another Spirit Island YouTuber, and like we were talking about lines on board D, and they just kept getting more and more interesting. Like we were doing board D Russia, and I remember that being so fascinating. How the Incarna movement was just so janky, but there were also a lot of cool options on the drafts and a lot of contextual play. And so, you know, sometimes even though we're kind of, you know, like trashing like bad boards like board D, I'm still glad they exist as long as they're not too bad. You know what I mean? Like I still think it's good that there are good and bad boards in the game. Um, but as long as they're not so extreme as like say board G is generally. But like because it leads to interesting puzzles, and this is part of the reason I like Spirit Island is because the boards add so much dynamic to the gameplay. So
Yeah, I got a story about this as well too. I think in the first maybe year or maybe even 2 years or so that I was playing Spirit Island, um, and I wasn't, super experienced. I had a lot of feelings towards board D that were pretty negative, and I've probably even stated in the past that I felt like um, this kind of setup seemed like an oversight or whatnot. But I was pretty naive at that time to say such things because the more that I've grown as a Spirit Island player, I've actually started to really appreciate how unique Board D's puzzle is amongst the other boards. And it's really an interesting challenge when getting into like the deeper aspects of Spirit Island.
yeah, yeah. I mean I still have board D love, even though I feel horrible for the you know players in like that Scotland 6 multiplayer game that get the board D special and they're tanking like 8 blight, and I'm just like, oh, that really sucks, you know.
Everybody's gone through the board D special at some point in
Right,
time.
right. And like you
Don't
definitely
let it get to you too much and try to
right.
overcome.
Right. And I think especially in solo oriented play, there's so many There's so many cool puzzles here with board D. And so I love the board. Even though I also hate the board in some ways because it is a bad board, I still love it. You know, it's still my friend because it's given me a lot of joy. So, um,
One of the coolest lore boards out there as well too.
lore.
Really
See, I
appreciate
don't really know
it.
much about the lore. Can you highlight that a little bit?
So lore starts in land 8 and land 7 on this board. And normally the biggest thing that lore players want is access to all what with one presence, access to all three of your coastal lands. But because your starting presence is actually in from land 8 is adjacent to land 1, you can still kind of get this dual presence coverage by growing into land 4 here and cover all of your coasts in that way while having multiple flexible usages for softly back in. It
Wait,
creates a
that's
really cool puzzle.
that's really strange, right? Because you're
You
covering
also
your
start in
whole
7.
coast. Oh, you also start in 7, right?
Yeah, you
So
get 2 and 8, 1 and 7, and then your first growth usually goes to 4. You cover your whole coast and now have Softly Beckon covering all your inlands on the variety of explorers. Board's like a secret tech board for lore in a way.
that is so
It's super
interesting.
cool.
Yeah, I will admit when you first said that, I thought you said the lore, like I thought like story wise. But so I was like, yeah, I don't know anything about the lore.
Oh my god.
But no, no, no,
It's great.
no, I think even lure, yeah, I totally agree. I don't play much lure, and I think that's pretty interesting. Um, I think last time I played lure on this board, I ended up growing into land 5 because I had to, and I felt sad about that. Like I felt that pull to land 4, but I couldn't quite put it into words at the time because I was a young, you know, like a younger Spirit Island player, you know,
Right.
and uh, and now that you explain it, it just makes a ton of sense. Yeah, that's nice. That's nice. um,
It's a cool puzzle.
yeah. All right. Well, do you want to talk about boards E and F now? I mean, I think the reason I'm mentioning these two together is because I think, you know, I feel pretty strongly that these are very good boards across many spirits, you know. Um,
They're really good across a lot of spirits. Even just as a intro, they are the beast spirit boards.
yep. Yep. And like,
Placement ranges, adjacencies, Dahan, utilization, everything is prime for beast spirits.
all right, well, you know, convince me. You talk about it a little bit. Like, you know, why is board E like so insane? Like adjacency wise, thinking about that, because remember that's kind of like their areas, adjacencies, connections, all that kind of stuff. That's the zone of discussion we're in at the moment. So
Right. It's got it's got everything in areas that you want it. You have two Dahan on the inland.
right, we've talked about those already for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you cut off 7, like you said, and get rid of that town, pretty much the entire coast is now pocketed away from the inland.
Hmm.
So four lands being taken out of the game on a board is pretty nasty.
Yeah, I feel like in large part, like in very large part, that has to do with like this section here on the board. Like the fact that,
Yeah,
let me think about it. Like it's a feeling right now. I'm trying to put it into words. Uh, I think the fact that land 4 and land 2 don't touch is a really big deal.
yeah,
Um, if land 4 and land 2 touched, then you wouldn't get so much mileage out of the inland focus about cutting off these lands and cutting off those lands, right? Because land 2 would inevitably, you know, having a city in it, kind of start repopulating 4, and also be again like if you let land 2 go, then it can't blight cascade into land 4 because that already gets blight, etc., etc. Like I feel like this part of the board right here, and also for those who like scenarios, if you like the Great River scenario, this is also a big reason that the
H,
Great River is really good on E. But yeah, I feel like that corner of the board is just it leads. It's such a simple thing, but it leads to so many strong patterns on board E. You know, in terms of separating that inland. Um, anyways, I
you
sort of
need
cut you off there, so feel free to
no,
continue.
that's okay. I mean, you can notice here that 6 other boards, all land 4s touch land 2. The only other one is H, but H is a little bit of a oddity because
Yeah, that's true.
you
That's
just have
true.
a different land which is also touching land 2 and connected to the inland. So it's like It's just far off.
Yeah, you're right. The only kind of thing that's similar is like Land 6 doesn't touch Land 2 on board C, you know? Because it's kind of like the reverse, like the mirror image. Yeah, and A as well, but it's not the same though, as like the potency on board E is just crazy in comparison to like, the inland control on C, which is a total puzzle, and then here it's like, wow, like kill that town, prevent a build, let this go, game's over. You know?
So,
Yeah.
Wetlands generally being pretty clear on this one as well. Make it a lot easier always to create pocket strategies on this board. The Han are in prime locations. You can always combine 1 to 5, 5 to 1, bring over 3 to 5, 5 to 3. Do a lot of different things with the Dahan manipulation on this setup too. There's 4 automatically adjacent to 2 as well, so you can just mass cluster them into 2.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think board A is like sorry, board E is insane in terms of the adjacencies. And even like this land 7, this land 7 is absolutely bonkers, right? I mean,
Everything's like free range to each other as well, which is pretty
yeah.
condensed.
That's true. That's true. Nothing's range 3. It's not like board A where like,
I guess 2 to
this
6 is
is
range 3 and 2 to 8 is range 3, but
yeah, but it doesn't quite feel the same. I don't know. I can't quite put into words why it feels different. Um, Maybe it's
'cause
because
if you're not on one of the edges, you're range 2 to everything. If you're
right.
in 5, 4, 7.
Yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. And also like if you I think one big thing here is hmm another thing I'm not sure I know how to put into words. You know what? I'll think on it. I'll get back to it. I'll get back to it. Yeah, I think board E has got some absolutely bonkers adjacencies for sure. And board F has some really good ones too. Like, we've talked about lands that are like really centralizing that control a very large portion of the board. One thing to note is like on board E, right? The only land you don't control two of is the mountains, and those are the lands that you want to let go, right? But in terms of like the adjacency lands, like you control both sands, you control both wetlands, and you control the most important jungles, which is that inland jungle, right? But like if you compare that to, oh sorry, I erased your line. I'll put it back in. Compare that a little bit to board A. I don't know if this is a real point, but I feel like it's a point. Is like controlling these mountains with regards to how mountains tend to play out, where we say that they kind of build up, they tend to be the dump lands. At least that's what the powers want you to do. The way that like minor powers and major powers want you to play. Being able to control both of these mountains then is kind of unnecessary. And also, land 8 ends up being like, because it has the starting plastic and isn't and is really separated, ends up taking on that role anyways in a lot of cases. And so I kind of value the way that board E gives me access to both sands and both wetlands like a lot more than here where I'm getting access to both wetlands and both mountains. Like I'd prefer to have access to sands and wetlands than I would to sands and mountains. Um, I think that's kind of a small point and totally like just nerding out, but um, I've definitely felt it sometimes on these boards, especially when playing like Starlight or something.
Yeah, I mean, even just calling it out, you have Uncanny and Drift to basically cover a lot of these different things. And then teaming as well. Just all plays into how it just plays into how the cards are designed and what they target so that they're most optimized for what is being built up according to the different invaders and stuff on the boards
Yeah,
in
100%.
general.
Yeah, yeah. So give me some rundown on board F, or unless you want me to, take a chance. 'Cause I realize I've asked you a lot of questions, which I appreciate, but
Yeah,
um,
I mean, I love Board F. I love Board F's puzzle personally. There's a lot of really weird stuff you can do from 4, if you are even starting in 4, because it's one range away from Land 5. Land 5 hits pretty much everything that you want within one range, but Land 4 also gives you priority over wetlands and jungles. Um, and most sand stuff, to be honest, if you have a sacred site in land 4. Like land 4 is the land that I would want to put a sacred site in, and land 5 is the land that I would want to put a single presence in for targeting other stuff.
And you know what's really funny? One of the spirits that I love to play on this board is Sunbright Whirlwind. And you can see why it's such a good board for Sunbright because you start with that sacred site, I believe,
Oh,
already
yep.
in land 4, which is juicy, right? I think you start in land 4 and then you have a single presence in 8, which isn't as ideal, but it actually, in a way, is more ideal because it gives you that opportunity to grow into 5 and get that Dahan reposition very early. Um, and or that explorer control early, and then you have that presence in 5 that you're talking about that I also agree is really advantageous. Um, not
Sounds
to
yeah, it
mention
sounds like a really good synergy with it.
like with Sunbright, you definitely will make plays where like you let Dahan just trade out for you, and like boom, look at that. Land 1 and land 6, that's where all the Dahan are. Because you're not necessarily a defend oriented spirit until you see the defend, but you're willing to play into it if need be. Um, and like you can get the Dahan out of here like after one of them's traded or something, then you can push this Dahan in here and suddenly have great control over 1-5 and 3. That's definitely like the kind of philosophy or plays that I've made before, where like early on I'm not really caring quite so much, and then as soon as I get that like call to guard, then everything changes. But I'm in position to do that constantly, and I think that's something that board F offers, and not a lot of other boards offer for Sunbright. Um,
Yeah, this setup and everything is really interesting and pretty favorable for Devon spirits as well and beast spirits.
Yeah, and I've talked about this board being a good board for Finder, right? And part of that is because, oh, excuse me, sorry. You
Oh
start
yeah.
here, and you're very often incentivized at a sort of more basic level. You're often incentivized to start here because then you cover 3 terrain types with Cirque, right? And that guarantees that you can get value out of paths and Cirque pretty well, while also being able to do something on turn 1. Like you're not necessarily always pushing that Explorer, but you can at least group up these Dahan, and then your Dahan positioning is like really set to go. You can kind of like when mountains come up, you can use offer to clear out 6 and then focus more on 4, which feels like saving an action because when you're playing offer passage, you're mostly playing it to activate that innate on turn 2 or turn 3. And so you kind of feel like you're getting that bonus out of offer by letting it clear out land 6 in a mostly edge proof way. The only thing that's weird for Finder is again that land 7 being really difficult to access with both paths and Cirque on turn 1, but it's got the beast, and like maybe I'm just lucky, but this good little beast Jerry here has dealt with many an explorer for me on F7. So
Yeah, it's and a lot of spirits that I like to play as well. It ends up being one of these really good boards in terms of positioning. Even just like wildfire setup on 8 is really phenomenal.
yeah, it's kind of
And
akin to roots on E, right? Like you start with the ability to kill that town pretty quickly should you want to. Um, and also, like a lot of lands have outs to 8 when you play Wildfire on F. Um, whereas when you're playing Wildfire on, like, say, B or something, like, it's kind of awkward to, get stuff into here. This beast is now well positioned, etc., etc. Um, yeah, I think I also agree 8 is a like F8 is a great starting place for Wildfire. And another thing I
you
like,
spend a lot of point on that is because there's a beast in 7. It really
yeah.
leverages so hard.
Additionally, too, is like when you're playing Wildfire, right? Those early turns, you're generally not blighting, like, first 3-ish turns or so. Usually underplaying, playing very minimal cards, or if you are making a tempo play, you're still not looking to blight because, especially for Trans Wildfire, I'm much more in the camp of delay that 2 fire. I think it's usually not worth it if you can avoid it. Um, and like, you start with the 2 blight here, right? But you can grow into land 4, which is such an important land to grow
Yep.
into if mountains
Yep.
comes up. And that's critical, right? Like imagine like jungles comes up
That's
first, right?
adjacent lands.
Like jungles comes up first. You have an explorer here, explorer here. You can grow into 5, push the Dahan into 4, and now you have a presence here. And then when mountains comes up, clear out that explorer, push the Dahan into 3, and suddenly you have prime, Dahan positioning. It just happens. It's like orchestrated, That's one example, and it's definitely not something you'd always do. Sometimes I like to group up this Dahan here, or even consider sending it into 2, if I'm trying to do some sort of sack play. But um, like yeah, being incentivized to grow into land 4 because it has blight, because you don't want to cause that cascade early, as wildfire, is great for your positioning because again, control of land 4 is just so important, and you can often let land 6 go. This is kind of the equivalent of like the land 8 on board E, so like on wildfire you end up saving in action. Like Mountains Explorer makes you very happy, very happy. um, yeah, because then when you G3, right, you can G3 into 2 or 3 and not have to worry about it because you're range 1 to everything. The only thing you can't really G3 into is 1 at that point. But, anyways, I'm nerding out too much on Wildfire. And speaking of Wildfire boards, I know I notice a lot of times in multiplayer games, Wildfires will tend to prefer board G, and that's because the starting blight is in sands. So you're here in the
with all
sands,
the starting board.
all the
Yeah,
starting blight. And I think that's an okay argument. It's an okay argument. Like I really can buy that. But
it offers
I
flexibility on needing to take the 2 fire early instead of on other boards where you don't want to because you haven't grown into the blighted land yet a lot of the time.
exactly. But the thing is, I think I would rather I think I would rather the blight, like there just be a blight in an important land, rather than all the blight being in land 5. I don't
Yeah,
know.
I'm not a huge fan of it. I would prefer a different board, but
Yeah, and also not to mention, I think it's a really tough board for Wildfire because like land 1 is range 2, land 3 is range 2. It's a little awkward to control Mountains Explorer on this board because you have to deal with this town and you have to deal with land 1, but you don't really have a great way to manage that. Uh, the jungles is like a super easy explore for you, so that's really nice if it comes up. But then like wetlands is terrible. Like, oh my god, have you played Sweden 6 with Wildfire
yes,
on board
yeah.
G and gotten
Yep.
wetlands first? It's awful because you start with a city here, right?
I know there's
And
2 spirits that can take care of it, which are, I think, that Keeper Aspect and Behemoth can just instantly quell that.
right. But for many spirits, this is like 2 blight here and 2 blight here. And don't forget, that's going to cause a mining rush here or here, and that's going to cause a mining rush here most of the time, because again, you're not trying to pile into coast. Like, oh my gosh, I really dislike the Sweden setup on this board, even though I know it's an okay board for Sweden. Um, I just don't enjoy it because I don't like how swingy it is, when I'm playing like kind of an app, like a normal spirit. But I think board G is a board that kind of gets memed a bit. We often describe it as the worst board in the game, and I think personally it is. Like it earns its title as the worst board in the game for most spirits. And I feel like there's a lot of reasons why. I might start with a couple, and I'd love it if you jump in. But I think one of them is this land 2 being adjacent to everything. Like, if you're not ocean, which is most of the spirits in the game, you don't really want this. You don't want something where like land 2 is so centralizing in order to pocket your inland. Like this is a nightmare board for pocketing and that inland control because land 2 is adjacent to everything. So unless you have like perma isolates on land 2, you're just not getting the same value as you would get out of like, just playing normally on board E and getting that very free pocket in the inland. Additionally, I feel like a lot of the resources on board G are kind of mismanaged. Like for instance, I really dislike getting like Sands Wetlands Explore into Prussia because the land 5 is super scary because that's your cascade land, so it demands that fast explore control most of the time. But then land 3 is threatening that city in a land with only 1 Dahan. While this is also building, you can't get Dahan in there because you're probably grouping that up here, and now you have to deal with like double wetlands scenario where the wetlands are starting to get built up, which is again something that we don't want. We want the wetlands to kind of be cleared out while they're easy to clear out with the minor powers, and not so much rely on letting them go. That's more the mountain's job, you know. Um,
What this plays into, actually, as you say, Alonk, is the fact that we have this, theoretical priority of how you want lands to build up and how powers are more effective, wetlands going down to sands and jungles, going down to mountains. Board G is the complete opposite of how you really want to play and approach the game, and it doesn't support what the powers are good at in the deck. Because our sands are building up, our wetlands are building up, our sands are already blighted. Jungle being the out with the beast, but our mountains are pretty solvable and kind of. I mean, there's even on board G, land aid is still building up, but everything else is also building up in really awkward ways where, like, oh, I have to take care of my sands inland land, but I can't take care of my sands coast. And if I take care of my sands coast and I got wetlands, wetlands are also building up, and I can't really take care of those now. And there becomes much harder of a puzzle with all the resources also spread out from those lands. It's in turn, to summarize it, like those lands get harder the more built up they get compared to something like mountains.
Yeah, I totally
It
agree.
takes more resources to complete the puzzle and finish the puzzle.
I totally agree. And even just like another aspect of this that's so simple, right? Is like, okay, let's say you have a sacred site here or something starting. Like you're, wildfire, or you're lightning, or you're bringer of dreams and nightmares. Like all of them start here, sacred site, right? It's a very common kind of, starting position. And you would think this is pretty central, right? Like this should be able to cover quite a lot. But because the coast is so important, the fact that your range 2 here ends up being a big deal. How do you rectify this? You rectify this by placing a sacred site in land 4 or in land 2. Like as lightning,
Usually land too.
right. It ends up being usually land 2 because otherwise you're not covering everything. But then that's the thing. Like, let's say you're lightning and you're playing into Prussia. You often have to kind of place into, or not Prussia, really anything, like Russia, actually. You place in land 2 because that gives you, the flexibility to cover coast. But then let's say land 2 actually comes up. Now you have to deal with a city land as lightning, you know, but you kind of had to be there because if you weren't there, then you wouldn't be able to cover your coast. So you're forced to be in lands that are by existence liable. You know what I mean? Um,
Yeah, you'd be essentially a lot of the times it may end up you lose a presence because of having to take the blight in that land, and now you've lost another resource, which in turn means you need to now spend more resources with less tools to be able to solve the puzzle.
Yeah, for sure. And I also feel like another thing is like, in order to mitigate this, right? Like if I were to try and rebalance board G, I'd really like to see this beast here be in land 4. Like I think that alone would be huge for making the sport a lot more playable for a lot of spirits. But instead, the juiciest resources, right? The like plus point 0.8 and the plus 2 from having to Han is all in jungles. Like these terrains are already by the board geometry kind of some of your better explorers, right? They don't have plastic in them generally, and they already have a 2 to Han. They already have 2 to Han here that are useful for covering 7, and they can go between 7 and 8, although sometimes 8 will just get 2 built up. This beast is just like extra acceleration on Jungles Explorer, which makes Jungles Explorer so swingy. It's like if you have a game with board G and you get Jungles Explorer early, it's huge for catching up. But if you don't get that
It's
Jungles
completely
Explorer, it's awful.
yeah, it swings the explorers in a heavier weight than on other boards, with the resources so piled up like that on jungles.
Yeah, I totally agree. And another thing that we haven't even gotten into yet is we've talked about boards in a solo context, but I'm a generally, very multiplayer focused player. And board G, I can't even tell you why. I just noticed that like for some reason, if this was like an inch over this way, then like this would be adjacent to a key land on another board a lot more often and stuff like that. Like even just the minute placement of where the land divisions are, I feel like I don't know, it's just a feeling. I can't really justify it super well. I feel like it doesn't lend itself as well toward multiplayer play. Whereas like on board A, for instance, these 3 lands are almost always adjacent to one critical land on the board next door, and stuff like
No,
that.
it's super true. Board I know from my experience as well, board A and C have some really weird adjacency things that they can do in multiplayer. And even F to an extent.
Yep.
Those 3 create really weird dynamics because of how long some of those lands are and have access like land 5 on board A, sometimes land 4 on board B, but it's really a central connector. Land 7 on board C or land 4 on board C.
Land 4 on
allowing
board C is so wide, right?
yeah,
And
and land 8 on F as well allows like some really weird stuff to happen in
yeah, and
multiplayer.
it's got this section here too, right? So it's like you're not only adjacent to all this stuff on this board, but you're also hitting a board across here, and you're hitting something on that board too. Like land
Yeah.
7 is sorry, land 8 ends up being really important, and like also land 4 here on board H, I think just ends up being adjacent to so much stuff, for free. um, which ends up being really useful actually, I think, into Russia specifically, because if you're playing a beast spirit or a control spirit and you're trying to take people's escalation, that land 4 ends up being critical. And I'd actually love it for you to talk about that when we get to board H, because I know you really like to play those spirits like Gaze, Many Minds, etc. So I'd love you to, just a reminder for us not to forget about that. But yeah, when you put it all together, I think board H just starts looking worse and worse, and there's very few arguments I can make in favor of
PG.
board. Oh, I meant board H. Oh, sorry, board G. You're right. Sorry. Yeah. Board G. Board G. Board G starts looking worse and worse, and there's so few arguments I can really make for it, other than that super swingy Jungles Explorer, which, like, yeah,
Yeah.
it's a free explorer when it happens, but having one free explorer really doesn't make up for all these other problems that you end up eating. Um, I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan. Not a fan.
It's when 3/4 of the explorers are all terrible. It's
Yeah.
just like, wow.
Yeah.
50% of the time it's always bad, and 75% of the time it's only a little bit bad.
Yeah. And again, these adjacencies are they're so screwball, like this being two away from this being two away from this being two away from this. There's so many range twos everywhere on this board. Yeah, gosh. Oh gosh. All right. Before I lose my mind, let's get to board H here, because I think this is also a Horizons board. Board G and H were introduced in Horizons Spirit Island, which is like that extra expansion or whatever that has the like extra low complexity spirits like Eyes Watch from Trees, Sunbright, etc. And a lot of those spirits are really interesting. And I think board H is actually really interesting. Like I like board H. I don't think it's like necessarily a super strong board. Like I don't think it's like F or E kind of level strong, but it's nice, and it's interesting. Like the puzzle's cool. Like, do you feel the same way? If so, can you talk about it?
Yeah, yeah, I feel pretty much the same way as you here. I think H has really interesting puzzles across a lot of different spirits, and in particular, spirits with presence mobility actually thrive on this board really heavily, and it causes a really interesting dynamic, which is also what is why I drew that red zone where it's drawn is to connect this. Those areas aren't where you really want to be with your presence, which seems crazy because those are where all the adjacencies are. But you want to be in a lot of these other different areas in terms of presence mobility for situational usages.
Yeah, I've noticed this on Finder, right? Because you start with, here obviously, and oftentimes if you get something like Sans Explorer early, it's really tempting, place here and push that Explorer out, right? But it's kind of a bad place to be because now this presence doesn't do anything for like 3 turns, unless Jungle comes up again, right?
Yeah.
Whereas instead, if you place in like here, right,
Oh,
you
yeah.
you have so many options as a control spirit, and you still
Yep.
can solve this, albeit a little bit less efficiently. But the
Right.
advantage you get from having a presence here going into those future turns is huge. So I totally agree with what you're saying from a finder perspective.
Yeah, it's almost a vibey feeling, and I don't really, have much proof, but all I can do is talk through it. From what I've played, you really want to be in these borders in the borderlands of H, because you're always one range away from the centralized lands, and most powers are those 0 or 1 range powers. So spirits with presence mobility are always just one away from being able to manipulate themselves into that land if they had to, or do 1 range placements into those lands via those uh, different growths that they have, or even just presence manipulation from their abilities or from their powers or whatever. they could always get there if they needed to for range zero powers, but being in across these other lands gives them so much more flexibility, not just for that board and for the solutions on that board, but also in multiplayer helping out the adjacent lands on other boards and being available for people to, push stuff into their lands that they're solving.
Yeah, I think that's a really good description of it. And actually, one example I'd love for you to highlight a little bit is playing like many minds or gaze, take your pick, on board H, right? Um, one strategy that you really like to do when you're playing with one of these spirits, for those who aren't aware, is that these spirits can basically generate reliable skips every turn in the late game. They can develop an engine where later in the game, they can skip a land that's just getting like explorers after explorers after explorers from escalations, Russia sixes, escalations from other boards. So, like, if other people destroy their beasts on purpose or you take them on purpose, you can take everyone's escalations and really save lands and save them so much action eco, right? And Gaze and Many Minds are really good at doing that. Many Minds can do this by looping EMS or Ever Multiplying Swarm and Dreadful Tide of Scurrying Flesh, so that you always create beasts and then remove them, create them, remove them, etc. to get those skips. And Gaze can do this by rushing bottom track, getting to that action eco early so that you can play that skip every single turn, and even hitting the reclaim one on a critical turn so that you can play that skip the previous turn, then reclaim it, get it again, and you can repeat that skip as well to cover the double ravages and stuff like that Russia will do often. But yeah, so after teeing that up for you, Ray, I'd really like you to nerd out a bit. I'm just gonna sit back here and munch on my figurative popcorn. I kind of want to hear the nerdiness.
Yeah. Board H is really a prime setup for spirits that want to play into the meta strategy of skipping every turn, because how the lands are divided here, again with this red highlight over 6 and 5, is they give outs. There's so many adjacencies that you can kind of push them out into lands that you want to build up, which are like 7, 4, and 8, and always get them out very easily. Land 2 being the one oddball that you do have to worry about. But if you've taken care of land 2 or get help with land 2 in any way, everything else is very quick and easy to solve and within reach. But 4 and 8 are always aligned for the most part to be against other players' boards in multiplayer. So it allows you to be kind of the prime tank that people can throw their extra explorers into. You don't have to worry about them and whatever. So you supplement this skip style with a lot of adjacencies, and if you need to cascade for whatever reason, or if you needed to take a blight in those lands, you have the outs to do that in whichever one you want to set it up in. And it's also very flexible, regardless of how you explore. Even with like gaze, sometimes your skip land is land 8. Sometimes your skip land's land 4. So it's like I don't know really where I want to push 7 yet, and you don't have to know until you can clearly tell which land is your skip land, because you can get it into both of them, and you can kind of reorchestrate everything around the board to eventually get into those skip lands pretty easily.
Yeah, I think that's a great intro there, and also that's not a thing on other boards. Like, consider like board C, right, where the starting beast is in land 8, I think. You could Beast Explorer for Russia. You don't quite have as much choice here. I mean, you still have the kind of a similar situation, but it feels different to me. Do you know why it might feel different?
It's land eight's pretty hard locked to stuff that only 7 and 6 would be able to get really pushed into there. So
Mm-hmm.
you're still missing, land 4, 5, 1. You really want land 4 to be your build up and the Russia on board C. It's always that feeling of like, man, if I can make that my land, it's adjacent to people. They can get stuff into it. I can get a lot of stuff into it, and even so, it feels like there's these lands are still pretty far away from it. I mean, in this situation, it does kind of feel like that, but I don't know what it is. There's a lot more flexibility, it feels like, with H. There's a lot more room to push stuff. So, like, a lot of the times, a lot of two stacks of Russian explorers will get built up, but H has so many adjacencies between those lands that you can kind of freely control those a lot easier than
Yeah. I,
how you can control them in
I
the
think
other board.
I think a big part of it too is that it's adjacent to coast, right? Just the simple
Yeah,
fact
both
that
of them
this
just adjacent to
both
coast.
of them are adjacent to coast. That's just not true on C, right? You know, like this isn't adjacent. So like if you get that jungle explorer on board C and you're not like dumping jungles, even if you are, this explorer's got to go somewhere, right? As control spirit, you know, and whereas on board H, it's like okay, you got that jungle explorer, great, goes to 8. You know, hey, you got that mountain
Yep.
explorer, great, goes to 4. You know, very easy. And not to mention, here's just another thing that I was drawing while you were talking because I kind of realized this is
Extra
look at
flexibility with however the explorers go.
yeah, and look at like the amount of just physical like arc length that you cover on this board. It's the
Yeah.
majority of the boards, like ideal lands for hard control strats, are adjacent to other boards. Like the majority of them are. Whereas on this board, right, it's more about it's like a little bit over half, right? But you have this area, right, that's kind of detracting from it, and you have this area that's detracting from it. Whereas here you just have these two lands, and that's it. Those are the only two lands that are contributing to contributing against you, you know, to being adjacent to everything that you want. And also, these lands are just wider, right? Like land 8, land 7 are kind of thin. So even so, if land 7 ends up being the land that you want, it's not necessarily guaranteed to be adjacent to everything. But these three lands are so large, they're guaranteed to be helping out those teammates. You know, um, yeah, I think that's. Oh,
Yeah, a
excuse
a
me.
lot of
Yeah.
spirits that are really good tanks can pretty much play these boards. This is another one that's actually really funny with lore because you're in land 8 and adjacent to the coast. It wasn't true before they introduced them, but this like board D has another interesting puzzle because you start in 8 and 7, you can grow into land 5 and you've now covered all of your coasts and have 8 and 7 as very prime, team focused help lands that you can build up into, and then you can grow into 5. You can go into 5 or 4. Fourth, the explorers lean that way, and then 5 obviously to cover all your coasts, and it pulls everything with softly beckon if you're in 5. Like the softly beckon utilization into land 5 is kind of nutty.
Yeah, 100%. I totally agree. Um, the only thing I don't like about Board H, well, I don't like strategically, but I like puzzle wise, is the fact that it starts with the fewest Dahan in the coast, right? And that's like a really bold design decision because if you think about it, you know, every board before this board has 3 Dahan on the coast. It has 2
Yeah.
Dahan in one of the corner lands, and then 1 Dahan either in lane 2 or at the very edge. And
Yeah.
here, it's just like, nope, you get 1 Dahan here, 1 Dahan here, but you get those extra Dahan inland. And
Yeah. One of the only things on top of that is in order to group them, it goes into the edge case land too.
yeah, exactly. And I think one thing I appreciate about this board setup is that it kind of nerfs strategies I start finding boring after a while. You know, like for instance, defense strategies, part of the reason they're so strong, right, is because they always address your coastal lands. And because Dahan can often be manipulated and exchanged through coastal lands, like let's say on board C, right, I have sapped the strength of multitudes on Vengeance. Suddenly, land 5 completely covered, land 1's completely covered, land 3's completely covered, and they're continuously covered because they it's 4 damage, right? So you're killing Explorer Town, you're killing City
Right.
Explorer, etc. Right? And maybe you get a little bit of extra damage from like a fear card or something, then you're full clearing. Like these lands, when they come up again, have to start over. They aren't already built up. But on board H, you don't get that luxury, right? You can't kill that city build when it happens into Prussia 6 here, you know?
Yeah.
Um,
You have to be either very specialized or board H is really leaning towards control and damage spirits, not so much defenders.
yeah. And I
Many
find
minds
that
breaks this rule because it can move Dahan at range too, by the way.
right, right. And I
I
find
board
this interesting because again, I think I've just gotten a little tired, you know, of drafting like sap every game. And I like that board H gives me a good reason not to. It gives me a reason to think about other strategies and draft other cards and stuff like that. And for that reason, I really like how board H changes up the dynamic, similar to how board D does. But I think
Yeah.
board H does it in a much more healthy way than board D does, right? Because board D is like much more extreme in terms of the balance. But board H is like relatively mid in terms of balance, and it's still changing up that game plan. I that to me is like partially why H is probably one of my favorite boards. And so I really want to give kudos to the game designers for that. I think that was whether it was intentional or not, ended up being something really good for like experienced players. Um,
Definitely, because it's such a different puzzle from everything that prior exists prior to it, really.
hmm Um, so yeah, so we've gone over quite a lot of our subtopics here. Um,
Yeah.
and there's one thing there's well, we promised a lot in this video. Maybe we won't get to it in quite the same level of detail as everything else, but one thing I want to quickly go over, just so we don't forget about it, is the majors. And you know me, I'm a Finder gamer. I love the major deck. Absolutely love the major deck in terms of using it to strategize to win the game, etc. Um, but the thing is, like the major deck has, in my opinion, some very very polarizing kind of designs, you know. Um, and because of that, it leans into board geometry. I'd say even more than minor powers. Maybe that's a hot take, but that's how I feel. But like for
It
instance,
is a little bit more than minor powers. You have to constantly be aware of your presence a little bit ahead of the game if you're planning to go majors in the game and really focus on those critical areas that we kind of outlined on the boards.
yep. And, like, let's just pick a random example here. Like some of these high tempo cards, right? These are cheap, reliable, powerful majors that often will get value. Tiger's Hunting, Flocking, Flow, right? But they lean into high tempo strategies. You're playing them to fast control, to prevent plastic, to accumulate tokens on the board in two of the three powers, et cetera, et cetera. And also, Flow giving you extra range is kind of interesting and how it plays out in terms of flexibility. But like let's say you take Tiger's Hunting, right? That means that if you're trying to look for Tiger's Hunting as a major deck out to a critical land that's about to build, you have to have your presence in jungles. Like that simple fact. And when you consider like, okay, I have to have my presence in jungles, and the beasts have to be in a good spot to utilize. Like already, you can feel the gravity pulling you toward board E, right? Because you already want to be in jungles because you're adjacent to everything, and the beast is right here, and you're going to create a beast here and be able to push it, and suddenly like your inland control via tokens, via fast damage, etc., and also just via presence placement is really emphasized through powers like this, and so like board E, it's almost like you accidentally play well, just by growing into land 7 for a reason that had nothing to do with drafting Tiger's Hunting. Then when you did draft Tiger's Hunting, you're like, oh yeah, I'm already in a good spot for it. And this doesn't happen on a lot of other boards. I mean, it can, but not to the same extent. And so that's one thing I want to highlight is that everything we've talked about so far only gets multiplied by the effects that are in the major deck. Um, let's see, what's another good example
I
here?
mean, just to add on to that a little bit, that example amplifies kind of one of the cases that we're talking about what lands you want to keep clear and like prioritize over. And you can see on board E, you now hit two sands, a wetlands, the jungles gets cleared because of that Tiger's Hunting, and the five that isn't getting built up is also accessible by that. So like, the reason why it feels so amplified is because it actually is. It's
Yeah.
hitting everything that you wanna be hitting and keeping clear for high
Yeah.
value for low cost.
Right. And then like consider that against a board like board A. Tiger's Hunting is a lot harder to utilize effectively on board A. I mean, you basically can't utilize it from 3 at all because 4 is that starting blight, so unless you draft Renewing Rain or something, like that blight's not going anywhere. And like controlling from whoops, sorry, I had a little lag spike. Controlling from land 8 is just not a good strategy because controlling from land 5 is. So board A is something where again those like wetlands oriented spirits are powerful. That also means the wetlands oriented powers, things like cleansing floods, are going to be a lot better. Now, cleansing floods isn't necessarily a very good power, but one thing that I think is really important about major deck strategies, and this is something I emphasized hopefully in my Finder guide, is it's not necessarily about winning harder. You want to make sure that a larger portion of the major powers you could draft are winning drafts. Because a lot of the major powers have situational things attached to them. Like they can only target certain land types, or like there has to be this condition for this bonus effect, blah blah blah, or even like pyroclastic flow. If you target certain land types that you just straight up add a blight, you can still use it everywhere if you want. But like, if you're not playing into these kind of things and enabling these things, then when you do end up drafting, there's just going to be fewer drafts that are available to you. One concept that's part of this, and actually something that I didn't really identify when we were talking about elements on cards way back, is the pre-drafting. Certain elements are, and I think you talked about a little bit, Ray, about how like wind pre-drafts major powers better. What we mean by pre-drafting is like elements from minor powers that are relevant to thresholding important major powers. Like, yes, that would suggest that things like, purifying flame elements are cracked because, these help threshold like really, really important powers like, vigor and instruments and power storm, all that kind of stuff. But it also goes the other way with some of the weaker elements, right? Like water, I think, is a really important draft because a lot of bad major powers end up becoming better when you have enough water. Or certain drafts like Entwined Power just aren't even online if you don't have enough like plant, like I think the card when it's not thresholded is significantly worse than the card when it's thresholded. And that kind of concept also ties in a lot of the cards that are better on certain terrains, also pre-draft better, but I won't get into that. It's this kind of concept. And so with some of these cards, right, like Irresistible Call, right, if you want to play Irresistible Call on board B, like, okay, you can. You're mostly going to hit land 7, but you have no coastal control, right? Because if you do it into land 4, you have a starting blight here. So if this land then comes up, Irresistible Call is just wasn't a good play because you're going to cause a cascade, potentially more than one cascade. And so you kind of have to do 7 because that's where it's going to hit like other boards. It's going to hit, your key lands, pull stuff out of 4, but then you still have to deal with the coast. But then look at the absolute monster aboard E. You're hitting a coastal land at the same time while also controlling not just part of, but the entire inland. Um, and so now, like the number of lands you have to deal with in addition is just 2 rather than 3, and that's a big deal. Dealing with one fewer or more land. Um, additionally, you know, let's see, what's another one? Do you have any? Do you want to jump in here? Do you have any like particular majors you have in mind with regards to how they like play out on certain boards? Just really anything to throw a bone to the audience. Um,
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that uh, is really important to pay attention to on majors is kind of ranges and those locations. So not just like starting setup, but the ideal locations that you want to be. Um, Majors end up being better when those synergies kind of align. Like we were talking about board A for water spirits, you want to be in land 5 and basically land 2. So most of the time, not a lot of spirits will have opportunities to be in those lands, but if they are, and you are playing that way, then cleansing flood gets that very easy utilization to be able to remove blight. And why this ends up being good is because land 6, 7, and 8 can end up being built up because you want to take care of 4, 1, and 3. So having like letting those go and then just getting free blight removal because you're playing a major strategy to the alignment of the decks, or not the deck, the board, uh the board's layout is like really good. Same thing with like Sleep and Never Waken. You've got boards, unfortunately, like G, where it's 2 range to everything, so you're now able to skip everything if you are in board G.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And another thing I want to add on top of that is this doesn't just inform your major drafts, this informs your minor power drafts. Because let's say you're playing on board A, right? This means that let's say you get 2 kind of equivalent cards, like cards that equivalently solve whatever problem you're trying to draft for. If one of them has Water Claw and the other has Fire Leaf, you will always take the Water Claw one, if they're
Yeah.
truly equivalent to you. And that's because Water Claws, pre-drafting, Cleansing Flood, sea Monsters, Flow, etc., all these cards that are really good when considering the Wetlands geometry. right? But if you're on
Yeah,
like a different board, you're not going to make that same decision. And so I think like when you play a board, it doesn't just shape everything we've been talking about so far, but it factors into decisions that will affect other decisions. Like the boards are so deep in this game and how they affect the gameplay, and I love that. You know, I think that's really cool. Um,
absolutely. Yeah,
so
everything ends up playing out in those really weird ways. Another one is thickets. When you look at boards and you bisect them in those interesting ways, like board C, I know I take thickets a lot actually, mostly because 7 and 8 tend to be those built up lands, and when they get built up, it's pretty much just free cleansing, with thickets and your sacred sites in the prime location, which is in 5.
yeah, yeah, no, that's super true. That's super true. Um, yeah, I think that's a really good point. So, um, since this video is very long, I think uh, we're gonna start wrapping up here. And the main two things left that we want to do are one, we kind of want to do a little rough tier list of the boards here, and we also wanted to do an event showcase. I think to really deep dive into all these events would take a while. But if people want that, you know, nerdy discussion, like let us know in the comments. But here are the events for your information that we feel like were pretty important in how they played out on different boards. And we encourage you guys to just start discussing amongst yourselves and like get nerdy about it. If you also share sort of our excitement about talking about this like board theory kind of stuff, and like feel free to go wild in the comments, go wild in the Discord, etc. And if you want us to talk about it, we can totally talk about it at a future time.
Yeah, these events I've also highlighted in the Discord specifically as like if you're diving deeper into the game and want to kind of feel like things are like less unfair and less swingy, I guess, with how the event is affecting your gameplay. Trying to look at these and playing to them and seeing like what you can do on the boards in relation to them is really really good to dive into.
Yeah, for sure. Um, I totally agree. And you know what? To cap it out, I think we want to just go through and do a little tier list, shall we? Like, you know, we won't do something super formal like the way Red does his tier list, but I was just gonna write my own personal rating on the left of the board, and I want you to write your rating on the right of it. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so let's do like S, A, B, C, D, F. Where I'd like to cover the full spectrum, where like the best board is S and the worst board is F, if that's okay. So for me, you can do plus and minus if you want.
Okay.
Um,
Hmm. In terms of design or
oh,
like
in terms of power level, sorry.
in terms of power level.
Yeah, yeah, sorry, I should have clarified. Yeah, you're making me want to revise here a little bit.
Yeah, I'm trying to think not too deeply, but
Yeah, just feelings. We're just doing this for fun.
I think I'm locked in here.
You think you're locked in? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the ones that we fully agree on are C and E, so woo there. And I'm not surprised we agree on C because I think that's both of our most played boards probably. Um, just because I know we've both expressed that we like the puzzle. We both agree on G as well.
My board
So
is problematic.
yeah. So, I think the things that are more interesting to me, I mean, A, it seems like we're basically equivalent. Like, I'm a little bit biased against it because of Finder bias. You know, you're probably a little bit biased for it because of the spirits you play. It's somewhere around here. It's somewhere in the B range. The ones I'm really interested in are F. Like, look how much we disagree. Like, I think this board is insane, man. I think it's
I think it's
crazy.
really good. I think there's a lot of spirits that can struggle on it, and there's a lot of there is a lot of strategy to the board, but there's also a lot of traps that are in the board.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
So I think most of the time it may feel like a kind of a B experience, whereas if I'm playing E, I always feel like it's an S experience.
Yeah,
Like
I
I
know what
just
you're
feel too
saying.
strong on board E,
Yeah,
and
no,
like
I feel the same way. That's why we both gave it S.
yeah. So spread across more things, it's like, man, there's a lot of weird things that can happen. But when
That's
I
fair.
get when you start mastering certain spirits, I think on not mastering, but in a frame like getting really experienced with spirits, on board F, you will probably start to feel more of that A plus range.
You know what? I'll give it an A minus. How about that? That more
I
fair?
was just I was just going at it as a broad generalist.
All right,
Uh,
all right. I
of,
mean, my
of
original rating was A plus. Like, I really like the sport, but to be
I
fair,
like the board. It's not that I don't like the board. I love board F. I'm
mhm.
just saying from a general perspective, there is a lot to it.
Yeah, that's
Like,
fair.
I'm
That's
not
fair.
gonna feel super powerful until I really am integrated and experienced with a spirit.
That's fair. I think that's pretty fair. Um, I think another one, I'm not surprised about us disagreeing on board B. In fact, I think you're closer to correct. I think board B, one thing we didn't highlight in this video is like outs for cascades. I mean, we did a little bit at the beginning, but board B usually has blight problems. And especially into Sweden, like, oh my gosh, try playing River into board B and Sweden, and you
It's
get
pretty
Jungle
hard for a lot.
Explorer.
Yeah,
It's
board B is a very, very popular, notorious labbing board for Sweden.
yeah, yeah. I think board B would be better if it didn't have quite so bad setup rules into Sweden, and also I don't like the Habs setup as well. I don't vibe with it. But
Yeah, I
yeah.
mean, looking at it from my way, it's like in general, you may feel pretty weak on this board in a lot of situations. You know, when you get really good at it, it's kind of interesting how we rated it because like I think it could go up to a B feeling, for some spirits when you're really good. But like maybe in general, it's not gonna feel that way.
Yeah, and I feel like the story is probably similar here on H. Um, right? Like, I think it's kind of a similar difference here, like BC, and I think it's kind of for the same reasons. I think your experience can get better, but it's, again, in that unfamiliar Spirit Island territory, even just from the simple position alone of there not being, equivalent to Han distribution on the coast and stuff like that as other boards. So, um, yeah, I mean, I think other things like board D being C minus or D. I'm biased. I used to say this was a D minus, and then after playing Roots on it, I had too much fun, which is getting in the way of my supposedly objective opinion of it being a C minus. But
I mean, fun's a totally different rating. I like board D now, with more years in the game. I really
yeah,
do
yeah.
enjoy board D. Do I feel powerful on it? I think starting out, a lot of people are not going to feel that way, especially if they encounter the BDS.
Yep, yep, yep. I think that's totally true.
And yeah, I don't know, it may resonate with more people. That feeling of kind of like unfairness to the board is there. It's a reality.
Yeah. No, I think you're totally right. I actually kind of agree with your list a little bit more than mine. Um, I
But like
will.
when
I
you
will
play it,
admit.
when you get into it, you can start to feel the power. You can really feel it like when you start learning the strategy of the board specifically.
I've noticed this specifically playing Finder into Russia on board D, a board that I never expected would feel good for Finder, actually ends up feeling good. I think a large part of that is actually the inland to Han setup in land 7. And the fact that like basically pushing stuff into land 7 and doing a big offer play here generally pans out really well because you can isolate this land and you actually have pocket. So it's like the turn 1 to turn 2 flow ends up being really good, but it's like a weird solution that's actually not that available on other boards. You can't really do that same strat on other boards, and so um, yeah, it's just one of those things that I appreciate that it's made me like have to come up with different stuff, different approaches, you know.
Yeah,
um, I really like that. I really like that. So yeah, I
I think
think
that as well.
I think this is kind of concluding our talk. We've nerded out here for a good long time, and I know everyone's told me that I need to be making shorter videos if I'm going to be uploading to my channel,
So
but
you made a longer one.
I know, I'm off to a great start, aren't I? But and my upload schedule is clearly a work of art. But regardless, I just wanted to thank you so much for being here today and nerding out with me, Ray. I think this is definitely something I've wanted to do for a long time because I think like really nerdy board talk is something that is like really hard to find. Like before making this video, I was kind of scouring like Board Game Geek and other stuff, trying to find people really talk about boards in like a more general theory oriented way and go into a lot of specific stuff. And I couldn't find any of this. And like not that I think I think there's many ways to play the game that are all valid. And that's great, but this is definitely something that, at least for my personal philosophy about the game, I feel really strongly about. So I'm really happy that we are able to, make this, put it somewhere, and for people to hopefully enjoy. And I really appreciate you joining in because I know that you're also kind of a theory tinkerer in the SI space, and I think that lended itself really well to this kind of format. So thanks for hopping on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on and doing this video and kind of orchestrating it and everything. It's super fun to talk to. I love theorizing in Spirit Island, and like you said, there isn't too much content out there. It's an awesome space to kind of showcase it, and hopefully other people are interested in it.
With that in mind, gonna sign off on this video. Thanks for tuning in, and if you guys have good ideas for kinds of theory discussions or interviews that we might want to do next on this channel, let me know. A couple that I have in mind for those viewers who have stuck around for the whole 2 hours and 30 minutes at this point, you deserve to know.
Congrats to you.
Yeah. The things I have in mind right now are talking to Arya in depth about synergy and support strategies in Spirit Island. I think she has a really interesting like set of views on how support gets managed in Spirit Island to its maximum effectiveness. And I definitely want to do a similar kind of nerdy talk. And I also want to do a series of kind of short form videos showing some like kind of unorthodox builds for a lot of weird spirit, like a lot of spirits, things that are very less commonly played, maybe more niche, but are maybe really fun or really effective in certain situations. And so just like very
Yeah,
uncommon builds. And hopefully bonus reclaim loop is up next if I get to it. Anyways, anyways, with that, I'm gonna sign off. Thanks for tuning in. Have
thanks for doing.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for joining in, Ray, and take care, everyone.